The venerated astronaut Neil Armstrong choked back a tear as he addressed a class of students, would-be astronauts, as he uttered this amazing phrase, "Truth's protective layers." He said, "We have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers." Peeling away truth's protective layers can sometimes come at a price. Sometimes the old treasured things must be torn down, killed without mercy or sentiment, to make room for new and better things, new and better ideas, truth to replace folly, a bold and brilliant reality to replace a time-worn lie. In addition to so many other events that have forever changed the face of society and culture and humanity itself in the last couple of years, very quietly, while attentions were focused elsewhere, a terrifying series of new discoveries has changed everything we know about ancient Egypt. Too much truth at any one time can seem like a bloodbath. It can seem like total carnage. The more of truth's protective layers that we peel away at any one time, the greater the cost. The greater the pain in some sense, like ripping away a band-aid from an infected site that started to grow gangrenous. There's going to be some blood. As the bodies stack up and the blood runs in the streets, as the rivers run red with the blood of the old guard. This might be why society prefers things to change gradually, one funeral at a time, as they often say about scientific advancements. But there are moments where the gradual approach, the kind where the frog is boiled incrementally, just doesn't work. Sometimes time is too limited. Sometimes we find ourselves in a burning building, staring at a riveting movie on the screen, unaware that the theater is caught on fire. Sometimes a freight train is hurtling down on children playing on the tracks, deaf children, let's say, and a calm, reassuring tone is not the right one. Sometimes you need to scream. Sometimes there's just not time to be polite, to be subtle, or to be diplomatic. Sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes it's absolutely brutal and bloodthirsty, but in a good way, in a necessary way. As we all gather outside the theater to watch its burning remains collapse, we all look at each other and realize how close we came to going down with it. And in those moments, we all come together and no one has any hard feelings about being manhandled out of our complacent, oblivious, hypnotic stupor. There are new chapters ahead, new and better things that demand and deserve our attention. Things that real life can offer, that no movie, however engaging, immersive, and hypnotic, can ever offer. When all is said and done, when the old lies we told ourselves have fallen to a new, bold, direct look into the eyes of a truth that's always been there, we can look back and see how important it was, how evolutionary, how necessary it was to leave the old thinking behind and step up to engage in the bold and challenging real world, in a reality where we participate directly instead of watching and letting others do the work and enjoy the spoils for us. My name is Chance Gardner. I'm the writer and producer of the Magical Egypt series. Today I'll be chatting with my friend, research partner, and co-producer of Magical Egypt, Brad Klaussen. We'll be discussing some of the groundbreaking and paradigm-busting discoveries that our 12-year research project has brought to light. Many of these discoveries are vehemently opposed by orthodox Egyptology, because they seem to be demonstrating that we were very wrong about the intelligence and scientific sophistication of ancient Egypt, and in fact much of the ancient world. But rather than waste our time chasing academic consensus that will never be offered, we've chosen instead to present this information directly to the world, in the open arena of intellectual debate, where it can do the most good, where it can be immediately put to the purposes for which it was intended by the ancients, to educate and improve the understanding of all mankind about the central secrets and most important wisdom traditions, the lost science, our lost intellectual birthright. The information we are about to present might very well be seen as nothing less than the long-lost owner's manual for human consciousness. Why do I call these discoveries terrifying? For those whose vested interest, reputation, careers, positions of authority, and an overall sense of being anchored in truth and wisdom is bound to the old way of thinking. For those who believe modern man is the smartest, most scientifically advanced, most culturally refined, most philosophically profound in history, these discoveries are indeed terrifying. For those who've always known that the things we learned in school were not accurate reflections of the truth, and that somewhere lost in the sands of time was a body of knowledge and a way of thinking, a mode of seeing, a model of everything, that would fix the insane death spiral that we're currently locked into. This information is not terrifying at all, but in fact is a ray of sunshine. It's a welcome form of intellectual life raft, thrown to us mere moments before we all drown. Why did Neil Armstrong challenge the new generation to peel back truth's protective layers? Because therein lies human destiny. All right. Well, let's not include that in the podcast. All right. I'm going to. All right. Welcome to the Magical Egypt podcast. This is a very special podcast. I'm with my friend, co-producer, and star of the research team of the Magical Egypt series and the Magical Egypt Aesthetic Research Project. We are going to be talking about some incredibly important new developments that we've discovered that cast Egypt in an entirely new light. This is an extremely controversial but powerful demonstration of what we've discovered, because it is self-evident, and like all good true things, it is self-verifying. And we're going to be laying out some of the discoveries that we found. Brad Klaussen, welcome.
Hey, thanks. Good to be here.
All right. All right, good one. Yeah, whatever. Whatever.
Get into it.
All right. There is a saying that John West was famous for that he used to always say, and I think he misattributed it to Gandhi when, well, some people say Gandhi was the originator of this quote. Other people say Victor Hugo. But there was this thing that John West used to always say, and I'm sure you remember this. He'd say, first they'll ignore you, and then they'll mock you, and then they'll pretend that they knew it all along. John West's life was plagued by his desire to get approval and acquiescence from Orthodox academia and Orthodox Egyptology, and it was never going to happen. John West won in the court of public opinion, but it became apparent to me in the time that I spent with him that he never was and probably never will get that acknowledgement from Orthodox Egyptology. An incredible saying that first they will ignore you, then they'll mock you, and then they'll say they knew it all along. Just within the last little while, a white paper has come out from some Orthodox Egyptologists. And it's a formal white paper where they detailed this thing that they called new research that is actually just an absolute, I don't want to say plagiarism, but it's an absolute restatement of the work that Gary Osborne has published. And we've detailed in Magical Egypt as the beginning of our own research project, or kind of the foundational discovery of our own research project, that Gary Osborne discovered. We've had this published in articles and on television in our shows since at least 2017. This white paper was in 2019, where they claim it was original work. But this really brought that statement to mind. First they'll ignore you, then they'll mock you, and then they will act like they knew it all along. We are finally getting validation and vindication for our discoveries from Orthodox academia and Orthodox Egyptologists.
Yeah, I think that in other instances where that saying is applicable, I've experienced in my own life. the hardest part is of that, those three parts of the process is they act like they knew it all along. Like, it's one thing when people mock you and make fun of you, and then another thing when they get mad at you. But then when like, oh yeah, of course, yeah, everybody knows that. And that's when you have to, when you're like, do you not remember that the whole time that you were against this whole position and now you're acting like, duh, we all. So that's that.
And the whole peer review process, the incredibly compromised and for hire peer review process, is specifically, it seems like it's there just to say, well, when you say it, it doesn't matter. So we're going to rewrite what you've said, and it matters when we say it. And so we can call it an original discovery because we are scientists and we went through the process of writing a white paper, and somehow that makes it credible. So it's our discovery and not yours. You actually have been doing some amazing things to formalize your discoveries, including the conference, the Arizona conference. What was the name of that?
It's the Science of Consciousness Conference by the University of Arizona. Yeah, but I mean, the unfortunate thing about that, as I've said before, is that was during COVID. So the ability to go in person was canceled, which I was really bummed out about, because I just had a poster presentation. I didn't have a speaking one, which meant I just basically stood in a hall with a bunch of other people having an adult science fair where I have a poster up of my thing, which would have been great because I just could have gone and had my foot in that door and tried to get some of these ideas into a more like academic, respected conference. But because of COVID, it didn't happen. So then they put it on, they just scrambled and put it online, and then everybody who made a video presentation just got buried under like all these other things. So I figured, why not put it up on the Magical Egypt site, because no one saw it anyway, and I feel like it's got good information, or at least a good visual representation of the main first plank of everything. But because it got pushed to just online, they were like, everybody can make a video of your thing. I was like, oh, awesome! Now I can actually make a video. But I was really looking forward to going and being able to just like network with other people and just get to try and like talk to people and have other people people walking by, because the posters apparently are set up like in a room where everybody can, like science. Sounds like a science fair. It sounds like an adult science. Yeah. But that was, at least to me, a sign that that there was some progress being made, because I think that's one of the biggest consciousness conferences in the States, if I'm not mistaken. So that was a little bit of headway, but I mean, the door gets slammed in your face constantly, all the time,
So let's talk, there's a couple of points that we should start with about precedent. One of the things that really lends credibility in academic spheres and in Egyptology, not that we're chasing that, by the way. I think that we are presenting this information directly to the world and letting the ideas fight themselves out in the arena of open debate. Academia can be very catty and just refuse to acknowledge certain findings. But one of the things that we're trying to do to establish that this isn't just a bunch of kooky artists seeing Jesus in toast, there are a number of established precedents where biology has been seen in art. And one of the precedents that you'd set was the Journal of American Medicine and the Royal Society journals, where you talk about Meshberger and Paluzzi.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing to me that is, I mean, precedent in the same way as like law, and in the same way in the medical community is sort of a component that once somebody else has done something or presented an idea, then other people can look at it and kind of validate it, or have it be proven in their own means. But that Meshberger paper came out in 1990 with showing Michelangelo's brain in the Sistine Chapel and the creation of Adam, and then in 2007, Paluzzi's paper in the Journal for the Royal Society of Medicine had other works of art showing what they believe to be brain anatomy. And to me, that's basically, partly asking for like whether or not academia could, approve any of this stuff. Be like, but you already have. Some of your own people have already discussed these things and already written papers that you guys have already accepted as possible and plausible. So I feel like almost by their own standards, you can use their own standards of precedent and show that this has already been established, and there's more examples of it. And it's, I think part of that to show is that it's like you said, this isn't just some sort of new age kooky people talking about, spirituality in Egypt and all that sort of thing, but it's actually talking about real biology and physiology and talking about how consciousness works. And it's something that the scientific community has actually delved into in the past, you know. And so it's to me, it's the part of the most, I don't think we'd even be able to do this if you're not standing on the shoulders of that precedent already. You know, I wouldn't feel as confident, you know, to say that this is just us finding, like you said, finding Jesus and toast. To be like, no, there's other people that have found similar things, and already we're just building off of what's already been established. You know.
You had mentioned Thomas Willis and Joseph Needham as both being members of the Royal Society.
Yeah, well, Thomas Willis was considered the founder of neurology back in the 1600s, and he was a founding member of the Royal Society of London. It's got some classically British name, the Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge, or something like that. But Thomas Willis is considered the father of neurology, and even coined the term neurology. And he's considered.
I'm going to have to change my band name now. I was going to use that as my band name. I didn't realize I was already taken. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Look good on a T-shirt. But he's a sort of a staple of the history of neurology. And he believed, or he speculated, he was an alchemist, and that's another one of those terms that people instantly think of as being like, oh, that's some sort of new agey hokey thing. When in reality, alchemy is basically just proto-chemistry. It's just, you know, I took a laboratory alchemy class, and you're doing chemistry. You have chemistry equipment. You're doing distillation. It became super boring to me in that class, because I'm just in a chemistry class. And so alchemy is basically just chemistry, very much so the processes of fermentation and distillation, and then all those chemical processes.
Transmutation.
And Thomas Willis speculated, he was very interested in what was referred to as the animal spirits of the brain, which is basically the cerebral spinal fluid or the nerve fluid, but they called it the animal spirits. That those spirits were crucial, or the nerve fluid was kind of crucial to life and health of the body, and he looked into the epilepsy and seizures and stuff like that. But he believed that the brain resembled an alchemical alembic, which is basically just a device that you has a glass part at the bottom that has a fluid or something in it, and you heat that, and then the vapors rise up to a smaller part. I think it's called the ambric. Weird alchemical terms, and then that condenses and hits the sides of the condenser on the top, and then that fluid drips down through a thin little not a hose, but it pours out. And so he believed that the brain was very much like an alembic, and that's somebody who's a huge part of academia. You know, this isn't a crazy kind of notion, but there's also, and Joseph Needham was a biologist and highly esteemed Cambridge fellow, who also he went to China. He wrote this tome of books called Science and Civilization in China, and all about all the developments that China has been responsible for, from gunpowder to magnetic compasses to irrigation to all kinds of stuff. It even goes into chemistry and alchemy in China, and shows how these Neidan Taoists would use the chemical laboratory experiments and processes as metaphors for how the human body worked. And he has a whole book about this, showing you how the Chinese Taoists were using laboratory chemical equipment and processes as metaphors for the way of the body refining its fluids and that sort of thing. So you have two highly esteemed academic scholars who showed that the brain and the body were very similar to processes in chemistry and chemical equipment and that sort of thing. And I think that also helps build on that precedent of the more modern papers that you have. If you can go look back into the early 1900s with Needham, and you can go all the way back to the 1600s with Thomas Willis, this isn't anything new. And these are big academic brains talking about this stuff. It's not a bunch of, new age spiritual woo-woo people making this stuff up. It's legitimate biologists and neurosurgeons, basically, So to me, that's what I like saying, trying to get the approval of academia is trying to we can use your template for how you approve of things and show you the work and show our receipts. And I think we're able to do that and establish that this is a legitimate actual thing, that it's not new to us. We're not the first people. Some of the stuff that we're presenting are new versions or new, like I said, the artwork that we're showing is more an artwork. but that concept is the same, you know.
Just as a aside, every time we've posted anything about this, I'm getting overwhelming response. You're getting overwhelming response as well from art teachers, art professors, and art historians, symbolists and sinologists. And the only people that don't seem very happy about our discovery is, Egyptologists and Orthodox historians. But for people who are steeped in art history and in the languages that art speaks in, they don't have any trouble with it. And there people are beginning to recognize what we've unearthed, this series of discoveries that show a completely different picture about the state of scientific sophistication and what the nature of the science was in the ancient world.
Yeah, I think it's the thing to me that is having posted that video again and kind of looking at it again, just even looking at the whole precedent, the whole reason that this makes even sense is that it's already been established in medical papers. People have already said like this has already been done. So it's just further, following in that footstep of that stuff. And I don't think it's that hard to, it was interesting. I was thinking about this today, that Michelangelo's painting and showing people that idea that people know that as a brain is common to the point now that I think it was in Westworld. Anthony Hopkins has it like on his office wall or something. And I think he alludes to the fact that it's a brain, but like that Meshberger's paper came out in 1990. And for a long time, that was like not something that was commonly known that people really thought about. But now it's interesting that it is, like I said, it's in pop culture. Now it's something, it makes me think that like it's a much more viable idea that you can have these representations of these symbolic representations of art. And even think about like, if you look at that cross-section of a brain or any cross-section of a brain, I mean, we have Michelangelo's image now of God and those cherubs and stuff like that. But like, if you were to look at that as an artist and be like, how am I going to turn these shapes into people? Like, that's a really difficult thing to do, to look at, like, if you look at a brain and be like, oh, there's a baby's arm here. And there's the cerebellum is this other person. And then Sophia's coming out of the thing. Like, that's a really, but then to still make it look like a brain, but to have people and forms in that and stuff like that. Yeah. That's a really interesting, difficult skill to be able to do. And like, I was thinking about, like, I do that with typography for concert posters, is I try and take like a water and I'll be like, okay, how do I make letter forms out of water? Or I take like a mountainside, like I need to make rocks make letters out of this thing. So I feel like it's sort of the same thing. If you look at these people that have looked at, and brain anatomy, and they've said like, how can I take that composition and kind of make people out of it, or make forms out of it that's not just the anatomical textbook image of this stuff, but it's actually got these people and forms in it and stuff like that. It's really fascinating. I feel like I said, it gives me sort of hope that for at least for like in academia, if those papers didn't exist, this would be even more easily written off as just seeing, Jesus in the toast.
It's a question we wrestle with. We get the people that aren't on board with this, who tend to be not artists. In fact, solely Egyptologists and Egyptology sycophants, Egyptology wannabes, hate this idea, and everybody else is on board with it. But the people that don't like it keep saying it's confirmation bias. And somebody actually said, you're seeing Jesus in toast. And so it really got me wondering, is there a threshold? Is there a number of correspondences? Is there a number of contexts and correspondences? Is there a threshold past which it's impossible to say something is confirmation bias? And I've been studying it. I've been looking at, semiology, as we've talked about, and actually looked up the technical definition of confirmation bias. And it's very much like if I were to ask you, Brad, have you stopped beating your wife? There's no good answer. Yes, I have stopped beating my wife, or no, I haven't stopped beating my wife. There's no answer to that. There's some things that you can whip on a person that it's like saying someone's difficult in Hollywood. I'm going to make a lot of air quotes today.
We did that with Chris Farley guy. I did my too fat for television, or frightened children.
So it's one of those things. Confirmation bias is one of those things that there's no recovery from. It's like saying you're insane, or like asking if you've beaten your wife. Or I saw this guy make this fantastic analogy about during the Spanish Inquisition, they would say, you have the devil in you. And no matter what you said, they'd say, well, you're only saying that because you have the devil in you, and the devil hides from you. So you don't know if you have the devil in you. Anyway, it's just, the point of this is it's one of those things. It's just like saying you're insane, or like saying you're a conspiracy theorist. I was talking to Gary the other day, or maybe it was you. I forget who I was talking. Oh, Gary, because he's doing that Rendlesham stuff. There's a really interesting body of work about that linguistic construction, those two words together, conspiracy theorist, that apparently that came into use around the Roswell days, when the army and the psyops people, like people who it was their job to do psyops, constructed this thing that they would try and ridicule people out of telling UFO stories. And so it became this like psychological kind of judo to shame somebody into not talking about their UFO encounter by calling them a conspiracy theorist. And that's kind of when you first started hearing that theory. And then they employed the same thing when Kennedy, like nobody in the world was really on board with the Warren Commission and all that stuff about lone gunmen and all that. And that's when they trotted that out again, conspiracy theorist. And it's really stuck now in these days when everything's so divisive, and depending on which side of the political spectrum you're on, it's a fantastic way to just negate anything that you say by just calling you a conspiracy theorist. And it's a very deep conversation that there's an orthodox reality. It's the reality that mainstream media paints. And as long as you conform to that agreed upon reality, and we all know it's not real reality, but it's the reality that you have to constrain yourself to if you're in polite society. And if you talk about something that hasn't been on the mainstream news, or something that we didn't all learn in school, then whether it's true or not, you're a conspiracy theorist. And it's I don't know if you had this in school, but I had this fantastic teacher that taught the classics in his English class, and he taught this thing called the 7 classic fallacies. And there's only 7 ways to lie. There's only 7 lies. There's only 7 classic structures. Like in literature, there's only 7 dramatic structures: man versus himself, man versus nature, man versus the clock, whatever.
Yeah.
And there's only 7 classic fallacies. And so when you call someone a conspiracy theorist, it's a combination of things. It's the ad hominem attack, which says this man is insane, or he's a pedo or something, so don't pay attention to his argument. Just let me invalidate you by calling you a name. And it's also kind of a argumentum ad baculum, which is fear of the club, which is that you're going to be punished if you don't agree with me and say what I say. And then there's another one that you and I run into, that's the argument from authority, that if you're not an Egyptologist, any findings you have that bear on Egypt don't count because you're not an Egyptologist. And that's a classical fallacy. It's a logical, its structure is flawed, because I'm not a mathematician, but I can go to the store and I can calculate whether 5 carats for $1 is more than 20 carats for $2. Anybody can use math, and it doesn't mean your math is wrong because you're not a mathematician. And so the idea that Egyptologists have been, not just us, but our mentor, John Anthony West, and his mentor, Schwaller de Lubicz, kept facing this not insurmountable, but this ever-present, ever-vigilant argument that we're not going to listen to you because you're not an Egyptologist. And it is this classic fallacy that diverts away from the actual arguments and the evidence that you can present, that your evidence is somehow invalid because you didn't go to school for Egyptology.
Well, I think it's even more so than just not being an Egyptologist. I mean, in my experience, it's just being outside of academia. I mean, even the things that I run into is that there's no one who's going to, if you aren't part of some sort of academic institution and stuff like that, it's difficult to get grants. It's difficult to even get your foot wedged into it, everybody listen to you. And I understand it, because really you're just a lone person emailing. Like, I cold email people all the time and try and be like, hey, look, I have this stuff that I think is valid towards actual consciousness studies or art history, or any of trying all the different avenues to kind of get in there. And and somebody even once said the system is designed to not let outsiders in, and so it's, and like, there's a part of me that can understand, because it's like, I was like, the fact that John was even willing to hear me out when I was thinking how crazy it is that was 2013. It'll be like almost 10 years at some point.
It's amazing.
Soon. But I was saying, like, the thing that made me feel kind of good was that I told John that, like, I bet you get a lot of people sending you crazy theories and crazy ideas all the time. He's like, yeah, I do all the time. And so, but when I sent him my own crazy idea and thing, he was like, you actually seem like you had something. So that made me feel like, at least, so I get that idea that there's going to be a lot of noise of just random people just throwing stuff. And like, I have ideas and I have theories. So if you're academia, I can understand you maybe want to keep that to, like, keep, for lack of a better term, all the riffraff out or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's so it's not even just Egyptology. It's just like academia. Like, that's one of the things that I keep thinking about is there was a Neil Tyson was on, like, Rogan's podcast or something like that. He made a comment about how so many advances in scientific fields happen from fields that are outside or tangent to
outsiders. Yep.
Fields. And he brought up the MRI, and he said that it wasn't a physician who came up with the MRI. It was I can't remember what their study of field was, but they realized that the MRI would be useful for medical purposes. And then Neil Tyson said that in his field, an astrophysics, people, their ideas grew because they shared the coffee lounge with a biologist, and then a chemist walks in. So they're intermingling their ideas with all these other schools of thought. And my whole thing is, like, the art department is a part of a university, or part of, like, so they should be allowed in that academic coffee lounge, and you'd be like, in all your fields and all your subjects, there are things that the art department can show you in regards to biology, or in regards to consciousness, in regards to those things. And to me, that's the hard part, which I'm sure it's true in universities everywhere, that the art department is probably laughed at as, like, the stoner hippies are probably just, making pots and, making ceramics and stuff like that. I bet they probably don't get very respected within academia anyway. But that's always been my angle, sort of being like, how do you get the art department into the academic coffee lounge, and then go, hey, I have points that are relevant to your field, I have points that are relevant to your field, and then you can just have a bigger collection of minds with different knowledge bases, be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or I never thought about that this way. That's, to me, that's the goal, is to get to get all these other people involved and have them be like, oh, you know what, that makes me think about something else in my field that you would never know about, but that I'm now seeing that it makes them, so that's the hard part, is that there's no way to get your foot in that coffee lounge door.
And you're absolutely right. That's the way science progresses. They always say science progresses one funeral at a time, that the old guards and the gatekeepers and the territory protectors will not hear anything. If you've gotten a bunch of government grants and you've made your whole life, accepted, a salary your whole life as an expert, and then some upstart comes along and completely disproves your most fundamental theories. Just for some context for people who might not know the bigger picture here, Brad and I were blessed with an interaction with this remarkable man, John Anthony West. John Anthony West was a proponent. He was a dissident, a dissenting voice in Egyptology and in human history. And like we looked to John looked to this character, Schwaller de Lubicz, who was around in the 20s. And like John, and like Schwaller de Lubicz was a polymath, and he brought a number of disciplines to the study of Egyptology. And he was also involved in the Theosophical Society, but he was a geometer. He was a practicing alchemist. He was like a neo-alchemist and a mathematician. And he had this just really interesting cluster of disciplines under his belt. And he was interested in Egypt, but he wasn't an Egyptologist. He went to stay at Luxor Temple at the same time that, do you know that guy's name? It's not Adrian Drieton. Etienne Drieton, preeminent scientist, like the big cheese of Egyptology at the time, that was at Luxor, along with Schwaller de Lubicz. And Schwaller was making these observations based on his knowledge of symbolism and sinology and semiotics, and then also making these really complex and very precise measurements, because he was a geometer and he was a mathematician, and he started noticing these significant numbers and proportions. He was the first one, I believe, to discover no, he wasn't the first to discover it. But anyway, Schwaller was aware that the pi ratio was on display in the architecture. Egyptologists to this day still say that ancient Egyptians didn't know the pi ratio or the phi or the Fibonacci series. But Schwaller demonstrated that it's absolutely there, and it's really easy to show that it's there. It's all over the place, and it either is or isn't there. It's a very specific shape. It's very important to artists like Brad and I. It's our trade. It's our MSG is using Fibonacci and organic templates. So Schwaller recognized this stuff. He knew a lot about symbolism. He knew a lot of Masonic symbolism and occult symbolism, and that is like an absolute taboo apparently for academics. And any mention of symbolism from the occult or from esotericism or masonry will just absolutely shut down most careful academics. But Schwaller, because he was a multidisciplinarian and he didn't have any of the particular baggage that comes with being an Egyptologist, he showed that there was this continuity of symbolism from ancient Egypt into the Renaissance and modern esoteric times. But the problem that Schwaller had, and the problem that John West had, and it's the same problem that Graham and Robert Bauval have, and it's the same thing that we have, is that there is this kind of gatekeeping. There's a club. It's an us versus them. There's one branch that embraces and acknowledges this, you can call it an occult stream, an esoteric stream, or ageless wisdom, or, there's a lot of different ways to discuss it. Some of them are more loaded terms than others. But in the 50s, Schwaller de Lubicz was on site at Luxor, and the premier Egyptologist at the time, Driaton, and this is at the time, Egyptology is a fairly new thing. Champollion actually had a residency at the Musée Egizio in Turin. Venice and I went. It was the last trip that we took. And it was where Champollion stayed when he was doing his work on the Rosetta Stone. And basically, that's where Egyptology was born. And at the time, traditional, like classic Egyptology was half plundering. It was very piratey, and that a lot of the reason why Egyptologists went over to Egypt was to see what they could steal and to take stuff, take the statuary. And they were the heroes when they got back to Europe and Italy and in France and in England. They just pilfered Egypt. Obelisks, that are in the Vatican and every museum. There's better stuff in Italy in the Musée Egizio than there is in the Cairo Museum. I mean, it is immaculate work. They took the cream of the crop. And so when Driaton was in Egypt, and he's making his studies according to the kind of dismissive view of Egypt, and they were studying Egypt from this basic assumption that they were primitive, superstitious savages, basically. And so they didn't think much of pulling things out, knocking rocks down, moving rocks around, and taking the statues out of their context. Schwaller, at the same time, was also in Luxor, and he got furious because he understood that there was no detail of the temple, especially the sculptures and especially these stealable architectural details, were all part of this book. And that it's sort of like if I took a classic book and started tearing pages out of it, you can't read the book when half the pages are missing. So Schwaller really took exception to this, and he kind of had words with Driaton. And at the same time, Schwaller was publishing these incredibly coherent and persuasive descriptions of ancient Egypt that the people loved, the public loved, and they made absolute sense. And they had this theosophical resonance because, man, Egypt is a garden of Masonic and theosophical imagery and symbolism. Driaton said this amazing thing that was the cause of this rift, and we're still suffering from it today. He said these famous words, "Let's erect a common wall of silence," when he was talking about Schwaller and the Schwaller problem, because no one could refute the work that Schwaller was doing. So they did that old classic thing like they did to Rupert Sheldrake. We can't refute what he's doing, so let's just ignore it. Let's just not talk about it and hope it'll go away. So some people say, he said, let's erect a common front of silence. Some people say he said, let's erect a common wall of silence. But basically, he said this to the other budding Egyptologists, the premier Egyptologists at the time, and they agreed to just not lend any attention, any credibility, never entertain this alternate view of Egypt, this other stream of Egypt, which, as we're discovering, turns out to be the right one, and it restores the incredible, awe-inspiring sophistication and science and intelligence to ancient Egypt that was kind of taken away by Orthodox Egyptology. But it is very much like a messy divorce, where the children in this case are the public, and you know how in a bad, ugly divorce, one parent will try and poison the kids against the other parent. Egyptology is full of vitriol and mockery. And, Zahi Hawass's famous phrase, pyramidiates. I call them pyramidiates. we've talked about this before, when you run out of intellectual bullets in a debate, you have to resort to name calling. The 7 classic fallacies, where argumentum ad baculum, if I say you're a pedophile and therefore your argument shouldn't be listened to. Nobody's saying that about you, by the way. But if I say, you know what I mean? If you, the ad hominem attack, where your argument is invalid because I'm calling you a name, you're a racist, bigot, homophobe, so nothing you say matters. It's a classic fallacy. It's one of the original logical structures that is a flawed logical structure. There's only 7 ways to lie, and Egyptology uses 2 of them with great regularity. And just because people aren't educated in the classics like they should be, they don't recognize what an obvious lie it is, that when someone stops debating on the facts and they start calling you names instead, they've already lost. So it's an interesting thing that this messy divorce happened in the 50s between Schwaller and Drieton, and his imperative to erect a common wall of silence has plagued us to this very day. And that's why people like John West and Schwaller de Lubeck's have never been able to get academic credibility, not because their work's not correct and provable and self-evident, but because there's just this snit, this feud, the Hatfields and McCoys, that carries on to this very day. Rupert Sheldrake took an interest in the gravitational constant, and he found all these records. And there was a period of time in the 1800s where the gravitational constant changed. It's been the same forever through all of humanity. And then in the 1800s, it fluctuated. Gravity itself was either lighter or not as heavy as it was for some period thing that nobody understands. And it was measurable. And people all over the world measured that the gravitational constant had fluctuated. And it's one of those tent poles of modern science that the gravitational constant never fluctuates. It's right there in the name, constant. And when he went around to show people his work, they're like, oh, yeah, we've agreed to just not talk about this. We've just agreed to, that just complicates things and throws a monkey wrench into the model. So we're just not going to talk about it. And guess what? You probably shouldn't either. And so in Rupert Sheldrake's book, The Science Delusion, he talks about that story and some other things that are intrinsic to not science itself, but the people and the personalities in science, that when there's some things that, like Douglas Adams says, nobody likes a smart aleck. Nobody likes a know-it-all. So it's not about the truth of this thing. It's about gatekeeping and territorialism. And it's an unfortunate thing, but it is absolutely true. And so the reason that people don't know these things about ancient Egypt, I'm sorry, this is such a diatribe, but is because of this divorce and this bifurcation and this really kind of unfortunate tendency to use the argumentum ad hominem to dismiss the argument without addressing the facts.
Because that quote is so famous about the erecting a common wall of silence around Schwaller's work. But I was sitting there thinking about it. I don't think I've ever seen what did they find so offensive that they had to keep silent. I mean, because basically what he would have been showing was that the Egyptians were actually a lot more intelligent and calculating in the precision of their measurements of their architecture and the symbolism of their architecture. Is there ever a quote from Adrian? Is there ever a
Etienne Drieton? It was in Egyptological journals, and at the time there was somebody else, Maspero or Mazzini or somebody, who came along and agreed with Schwaller, and so it was. But it was like Rupert Sheldrake. They couldn't argue with his science, so they just decided to not talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's I think, in the same way that you had the brilliance to see what pick up what John was putting down. I think John had that. None of us would know about Schwaller if it wasn't for John. Yeah. So I think it's that.
And Robert Lawler also. Robert Lawler translated The Temple of Man, and Lawler met with John early on, and somehow John deciding to pick up Schwaller had to do with Robert Lawler, so he should be acknowledged in this lineage of amazing people. John got from him then. He was living with me for a while. He stayed here for a good period of time. And
I remember you talking about that. Yeah.
Only recently, in the last couple of years, I don't think it's any secret now that Google and YouTube both are practicing this overt censorship. And rather than letting ideas fight it out in the open arena, of public debate, they've adopted this policy that anyone who doesn't say what we like will just not have a voice. And it used to be like Chomsky used to say, when people say there's no censorship in the media, Chomsky used to say, well, there absolutely is, but you can't hide the truth, but all you really have to do to hide the truth is just make it mildly inconvenient for people to find. And so if you make it a truth that you have to go searching for, most people won't know it because they prefer to just let someone else do the research and the thinking and get their picture of reality from TV. And so Egyptology did the same thing with John West and Robert Schoch, and the new generation of John West, and after that, Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval, and then we're kind of the third generation after John. That rather than an open arena and a robust scientific curiosity and the desire to entertain, challenging new ideas, we get shut out, we get suppressed, we get mocked and ridiculed, and they just will not hear us, which smacks of insecurity to me. And the reason why what Brad and I and our third research team member, Gary Osborne, we started this, we call it a forensic recreation of ancient science through a study of ancient aesthetics, that people whose wheelhouse, people whose bailiwick is in art. We understand art. We spend our lives as professional artists. We understand the language that art speaks in. We understand that there are things that are absolutely not argued with. They're absolutely provable precedents from other fields where art speaks in this certain language. And it's not a language that Egyptologists tend to recognize, or if they do not like the fact that what the art says really is a paradigm busting thing, and it paints a very different picture of human history than the traditional model of human history that we've been taught in school. And so that is sort of where we're coming from, and that the documentary where we show these findings, the Magical Egypt series, is a presentation of artists looking at ancient art. It's not New Age, it's not theosophical, it's not insane. It's just this presentation of this very confrontational art. And it's not just art, but it's art that demonstrates pretty conclusively, in my opinion, that the sophistication of ancient science is way out of proportion with what we've been taught. And in particular, it is a science that's different than ours because it's a science whose central focus is on the mysteries of consciousness and the biological origins of consciousness, which is, oddly enough, in all of today's modern technology, it's the one notable blind spot that science still can't explain what consciousness is. And they try and say that it's nothing and it doesn't exist, that it's a byproduct of electrochemical impulses in your brain, but they fundamentally can't explain what it is. And the ancient science seems to be solely focused, or with that as the very starting point, that consciousness is the only thing, it's the most important thing, and everything devolves from consciousness. And so what we've uncovered through the study of art, and we've kind of reverse engineered or done this forensic recreation of ancient science that is extremely consciousness centric, and it really shows a completely unexpected degree of sophistication and understanding about consciousness itself.
I think it's something that's, to me, fascinating because it's actually usable, applicable towards modern day, and we could expand our understanding of consciousness in the brain and the body by looking at this artwork of our ancestors and understanding it from the symbolic aspect that artists understand. I was thinking about it today, like, I mean, an archaeologist or an anthropologist or a historian might have some understanding of art in some way, but like that, they shouldn't be the people that are necessarily looking and studying art. Yeah. I mean, they might be finding it and digging it up and understand a history of the people and that sort of thing. But I think, to me, what I've learned about being an artist is that art transcends time. Like, as you being a person who makes art and I'm being a person who makes art, I understand that creative process and how to put symbols and things into imagery and how to convey those sort of things. Yeah. So the fact that artists are sort of left out of the conversation of this academic process, to me, is what I hope that we can try and wedge and say, like, listen, you have all these academic fields, but the art department is part of academia, and so we actually have valid things that affect other subjects within academia, and you should start listening to artists to tell you what art means, instead of listening.
I think people are going to listen now after the series of things we presented, and also modes of art, or the languages of art. We've talked about the Gestalt switch technique, and some of the things that we found are very reminiscent of the Gestalt switch, where in Gestalt switch illustrations, you kind of see two things at once. You see a young lady who's simultaneously an old woman, and you reframe and you see something. So the ram sphinx, where one moment it's a man standing under a ram, but then when you understand what you're really looking at, there's a Gestalt switch that takes place and it becomes a brainstem, or with Ishtar and Inanna, or with Gary's Atef crown. So there are modes of art, there are languages of art. We've talked about Hegel and the three ages of art, where there was the symbolic, the classic, and the romantic, where literally the function of art used to be didactic, to teach and to transmit, to unify with science and unify with the culture's most important means, and transmit those things for those with eyes to see. So this precedent has been around for a really long time. And to your point, exactly right, that artists, in a weird way, are uniquely qualified to talk about this. And it kind of stands to reason that this stuff was hidden in plain sight. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I can see why there's a lot of resistance from academia and Egyptology, because it's kind of embarrassing once this is pointed out. This is a fundamentally important and ground-changing thing. And a lot of people in the humanities just hate it, especially if you've gotten government grants and your pride is tied up with you being an authority figure. So I can understand why there's some resistance, but it's interesting that artists have finally come along. Right before John died, I talked to him pretty much right up till the end. And one of the things, John died sadly before I finished, I think I'd finished episode 1 and was in the middle of episode 2 when we lost John. And so it was such a gutting thing for me, because, in a lot of ways, he was kind of my father figure. And I really wanted him to see this thing this series of discoveries we made that validated his work. And he set us on to this with the most general idea that I believe there is some biometric stuff in the art, Hathor being the uterus and things like that. And with John's kind of initial direction, and then Gary Osborne's foundational findings, we kind of took that and ran with it. And I really was hoping he would have lived to see this validation that we've produced. Plus, it was just like a love letter from me to my intellectual father. That's kind of disrespectful to my actual father, but I mean, my mentor, let's say, not my father. I'm sure John never knew my mother. Elvis knew my mother. Elvis used to flirt with my mother when she was a waitress in Las Vegas.
Wow, wait, what? My mom,
that's where I get my sideburns from. It might be genetic. It might be genetic gifts from the king.
When my mom was 16, she interviewed Paul McCartney for like her school paper, and
wow.
He asked her to go to their say. He didn't. I always say like he didn't get asked out, but he said he invited her to a party they were having later. He said you should come. And I was like, did you go? And she's like, no, I didn't go. And she was like, my mom would have never left
Here's
me.
the thing. If she went, she wouldn't tell you. Because now that I'm looking at you, I see a little bit of Sir Paul in your face.
I'd be much older. But she made the funny point where she's like, he wasn't inviting. He just like, hey, you're a chick, come to this party, and he wasn't going to pick her up on a date, like drive up and like, hey, come and get in the car, love. But the thing that I think about that, I was thinking about that with John too, is that I when I showed him my work in 2013, which was like, the impetus for you and I getting in contact, because I showed it to John and he said, my partner Chance and I are thinking about starting up the Magical Egypt show again, and this would be perfect for it. And so then he passed along my stuff to you. And that was 2013. So it's almost been a decade. And I think about it all the time. I was thinking about it before we talked, like it makes me sad to I didn't know John like you did. Obviously I went on one of his tours, and then I went to his house when I presented this stuff, and I would trade some emails with him, that kind of thing. But you traveled and toured and known him for forever. But so when I so badly wish that I could show him now how much more I understand about this and how it's progressed. Like my understanding of it over the last decade has grown so much. And I feel like I would have so much more to give to him to be like, look at this, look at this, look at this. My favorite thing when I showed him this stuff when we were talking was, I heard this all the time when whatever we were talking about. If we were just talking about anything, he would say, he'd think about something I said and he would go, well, no. That's all I would say. Which is like, no, that's not right. What you're saying isn't correct. But I so badly wish that he could. Not that, but I mean, imagine what he would have contributed to.
Oh my God!
To season X, to the Kundalini episode, and then even I was thinking, he probably couldn't have been even in season 2 because he was dealing with his being with brain cancer, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't even film him for that. You couldn't even, you know.
Yeah.
But just imagine if he was here the whole way
Yeah.
corroborating this stuff. I mean,
I would love to hear his take on COVID and the vaccinations. And I mean, he lived for that stuff. George Carlin too.
That's
what a loss.
The whole other societal stuff. Yeah, he would have all kinds of opinions.
He had a field day with that stuff. I keep meaning to contact Jerry Salente one of these days, and we should do a memorial show for John one of these days and get Salente and the people that really. So here's the reason I bring that up, though, is that one time when I was talking to him, and I have this Skype, I recorded it, but he looked really bad, and I don't like using the footage because he wasn't the vibrant, vigorous man that we used to know. But I told him the idea of the new series 2 and series 3 about magical Egypt, that what we're trying to do is get it out of the arena of bullies and gatekeepers. We're trying to lift it out of Egyptology, because Egyptology keeps dismissing us by saying, well, you're not an Egyptologist, so your opinion doesn't matter. And my goal, or the thing that I did in season 2 and 3, was we lifted it out of the arena of Egyptology and set up a new arena, which was the arena of art, where we can say, well, you're not an artist, so who cares what you think? Yeah. And it's the reason why we may never find acknowledgement from academia. I think we will eventually, but certainly the people, every time we post our, we've talked about this, every time we've posted our findings as they've progressed, we get overwhelming acknowledgement and support and congratulations from the art community. But Egyptologists are kind of and I say Egyptologists with a broad brush. There's a new generation that really have been raised in, not the shadow of John West, but raised and have an acknowledgement of the brilliance of John West. But the old guard, Zahi and Mark Lehner and that old school absolutely will not ever entertain it. But it was like one of the only compliments he's ever given me when I told him we want to move it out of Egyptology and put it into the arena of art so that we can say, well, you're not an artist. Who cares what you think? He goes, Chance, that's brilliant. And like, he lived to put me down. Like, he had nothing but contempt for television and TV people. And he never, like, to my face, he was very generous and kind when I wasn't in the room. He used to say nice things about me. He said something really nice on Joe Rogan about me. But it was the first time he'd ever complimented me to my face. He goes, Chance, that's genius. And that's Magical Egypt 2 and 3. What we've done is we've stopped humping the leg of Egyptology. We've stopped trying to get acknowledgement on their turf. We've changed the turf. We're throwing a party in a place that, they can come if they want to, but it doesn't matter if they do. Egypt was so sophisticated that they schematized, and not just the biological components, not just the hardware, but then went on to schematize consciousness itself with things like the reconciling principle, Horus and Set blessing the pharaoh, and all of those schematic and dynamic relationships between the gods really were schematizing and providing a model of consciousness itself. And so that's why we keep saying this is nothing less than the long lost owner's manual to the human psyche, that this is incredibly important stuff. And the one thing that hasn't changed, architecture, fashion, music, language changes over time and across the world. But the one thing that never changes is the structure and the tendencies and the nature of human consciousness.
Yeah, and even I like to go to that statue of Horus and Set with their hands both on either side of them, their hands on the head, like understanding, like from an artist and a symbolic point of view, we've talked about, like, that statue is the whole thing right there. Like, it says so much in that thing, and if you were to show that to most people, they would be like, it's a bird-headed man and an anteater, or what is Set supposed? He's like an aardvark, or what? I don't know what he's supposed to be. But
some people say he's a composite animal. But he looks like an anteater to me, and he also looks like a certain kind of jackal. But anyway, we can talk about that.
But like, they would just think, like, they wouldn't necessarily think of that. They just think of, like, oh, these are the primitive beliefs of these naive people who believe in some sort of weird animal-headed beings. I'm like, but no, it's highly symbolic, and that statue is so rich with
it unfolds and it unfolds. And there's layers and layers. So Horus is the avenger. Horus is the thing that's born from Isis and Osiris, by the way, which is really interesting. So consciousness is born from physicality, or from the meat and the blood, and is consciousness. It's this emergent property. So, and also Horus flies. Horus is aspirant, or, like consciousness. Consciousness flies. Consciousness can rise itself. There's a unique perspective that you get when you're a flying bird that you don't get on the ground. And then Set is, as a composite animal or as a dog or as a whatever, he is representative of all of our lower chakras, our base, our desire to kill and eat meat and selfishness and ego and all of the earthbound things. Like in Italy, they have that symbol of the winged lion chained to the terrestrial lion. Horus and Set are these incredibly detailed schematics of what Ian McGilchrist detailed in his amazing book, The Master and His Emissary, these two hemispheres, which Horus and Set are specifically pointing to in the statue. One's pointing to the left hemisphere and one's pointing to the right.
The temple.
These are the properties of the left and right hemisphere. And so it is an amazing thing that after all of this time, McGilchrist and the cutting edge consciousness scientists are tapping into what this thing, consciousness, this basic bifurcation in ourselves. We have two different people in us that are always at war, the eternally paired adversaries. And then the pharaoh in the middle is like the man in the chariot who steers the two sphinxes. That your job as a person, as an esotericist, as a psychonaut, that third voice that is even harder to explain gets to govern and marshal and judge over the two fighting voices, that left hemisphere of base urges and aggressions, or id, and the right hemisphere of aspirational spirituality, that you're the charioteer, you're the king, that the pharaoh that reconciles the two elements.
Yeah, and that statue is basically, Luke Skywalker with Yoda on one side and Darth Vader on the other side, or it's the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other, and in those, every story that we've been telling ourselves over and over again is about good and evil, and this battle between good and evil. And if you understand, going back to the physiological aspect of this, of not giving into the temptations and not giving into those lower base desires, but being more virtuous, that has an effect on what hormones are being released into the blood and what is happening to the physiology of the body. So it's not just, hey, don't be an evil person and do bad things, and don't be a good person. That it has a physiological effect, that when you don't give into these temptations, when you aren't negative and you aren't hostile or angry or lustful or greedy, but if you are virtuous and you try and not give into those things, it affects the hormonal balance, which affects the blood. And so even you could be like, well, it's just a story about good versus evil. And like, yeah, but then you keep, like I said, it's more levels to that, and it gets into this. To me, I think that's why you need to have artists looking at these things, because to the most people, they would just say like, oh, it's just, these old people and these are their weirdo gods that they believed in, and the pharaoh, they honored the king. And that's such another thing too, which is the notion of kingship and these rituals of kingship and the pharaoh becoming pharaoh, this idea that every pharaoh of Egypt had to unify Upper and Lower Egypt, is one of those things where it's like, why would they constantly have to be doing that? Why would they repeatedly have to be unifying these two lands? And you understand it as a metaphor between that Horus and Set, that upper and that lower, that positive, that negative, the virtuous and the vice. And so the idea of going through kingship rituals, or the pharaoh becoming the pharaoh, or Osiris becoming Horus, is this idea of rebirth and regeneration. And so if you don't take kingship literally as somebody becoming a ruler over a group of people, but it's the ruler over yourself, and you become king and ruler of your own temple and your own
as
kingdom.
a metric of saying you've lifted yourself up to the high, you've self-actualized, to use that modern term. You've gotten to the highest state, you've perfected yourself, and you've become royalty, like the sword and the stone. You become
even that you have dominion. You have smited your enemies, or the vices that rule your kingdom. If
you are a master of your own domain. Like
Seinfeld. That Seinfeld episode has some profound aspects to it too. I don't know if they meant to do that or not, but that idea of kingship is that idea that you decide, you are in charge. Like, I am not a king of my temple. I let my vices tell me what to do, and I run and do errands for them all of the time. And so that's another aspect of this, is that instead of like historians looking at this idea of like, oh, these ritual ceremonies like the Sed festival in Egypt and stuff like that, where, they're much more in those ceremonies. I think they've said like kingship ceremonies and funeral rites and rebirth rites, I can't remember what it is, but there's three, and the ceremonies are almost interchangeable. They all go through the same processes, and you go through a ritual ceremony thing, and you spend the night in basically an isolation chamber, and you're supposed to have a vision, and you arise as the pharaoh or the king or whatever. Those are basically enlightenment psychedelic trips that they're basically saying. You're sitting in a dark room and you're having a vision, you're having an experience. You wake up, you come out when the sun comes up, and you're a new man, you're a new person. You emerge from the tomb reborn. So I think you talk about like some of the embarrassing things about humanity. I think about this all the time. I mean, no disrespect to anybody's religion, but I think one of the most comical errors of the whole human species that goes back through as early as we can is that the masses of people took these parables literally, and we fought wars over them because people read this poetry and this artwork as literal history and completely miss the point, and have completely missed the point of art and symbol, to the point that we have whole legions of these religions that are based upon taking story as a literal historical fact. I mean, it'd be like if people thought Star Wars was a galaxy long, long ago, that this was a true history of things that really happened. I think it's somewhat embarrassing for us as a species if our ancestors came back and said, well, you took all those stories literally? Like, what are you doing? Like, those were symbols. You're supposed to, and even in in the Bible, that Christ tells the teaching to his 12 disciples because they have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, and he gives to the masses parables because they don't have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. So he's giving them something that's basically saying, here's a riddle, there's a lesson in it, you have to solve it for yourself and figure it out. And what do the people do is they take the riddle as a literal true story, and then they just go, this is what happened, you told me. It'd be like if you thought the tortoise and the hare was a true story. And so I think to me, as an artist who spends my time trying to encode symbols into something,
you deal in metaphor and visual allegory.
Yeah, all the time. And not only that, just as dealing for posters for music, what does sound look like? How am I supposed to, what am I supposed to make sounds look like? How did that sort of synesthesia of turning one sense into a different sense? So as a graphic designer, I'm in yourself as an artist, we're familiar with the idea of loading images and putting information into them. And so as people who do that for a living, we can see when other people in the past are doing the same thing. I can go to the museum. Every time I go to the museum and I can look at Renaissance paintings or stuff, I can see symbols in there where I'm like, oh, this person knew some things, and I can tell what they're relating to, and even though that we are from totally different times and different country and that sort of thing. So
there's a hidden stream that runs through art that is clearly esoteric, and as we've discussed, Da Vinci and Michelangelo and a lot of other Newton, but amazing artists seem to have been part of this fraternal brotherhood that carries on through Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. In a minute, I want to show some graphics. I'm going to do a screen share and show some graphics, and we'll talk through the specific discoveries that we made in the art. But what we found was, just to kind of put it into words, and words are really clumsy. Once you see the art, it becomes much harder. I mean, it becomes, in my opinion, impossible to deny once you see the art. But to put it into clumsy words, votive images, fetish images, art, statues that all depict divinity tend to be where this art is clustered. And the more I think about this, the more I think that it's entirely possible that the idea that these were religious artifacts, that it was deity worship, I think that might be a really like Victorian projection that we're sending backwards and saying, oh, they worshiped these gods, which sounds idiotic. And when you think of art and you think of the possibility that spirituality was more like science than spirituality, or more to the point that divinity wasn't considered bearded guy in the sky, but that they understood that the only spark of divinity that we participate in is consciousness. And so what an interesting conjunction of symbols and symbolism. For people that study semiotics, there's the symbol and then the referent, the thing that the symbol teaches you about or refers to. And so what we found and what we're going to show is these pieces of art, and symbolically or mythologically, they represent these deities, these deistic figures, Ishtar and Inanna, Osiris, and Baphomet. We'll talk about that today too. And if you just slightly change your perspective from thinking that these were just superstitious primitive idiots who made these statues and then thought, this is the God, he's visiting me through this statue. If you think about the fact that maybe instead of this really one-dimensional religion that we've superimposed over the past, they had a rightful understanding that the true divinity, the true deity, was this ineffable, unexplainable thing that doesn't participate in the material realm. That is consciousness. It's the ultimate mystery to today's scientists. And so what we found is this really interesting conjunction where icons of what we call religion, religious importance in the past, were not only depictions of these figures, and they're weird figures. They're not anatomically correct, and they have all these details that don't really belong there if you were just trying to represent a figure. In particular, Brad made a series of discoveries that what cemented it for me, honestly, was the standard and the fused legs. That anyway, the point of this is we're going to show a series of artwork of statuary and art, and you'll see that in every case, the legs are fused together. It's not two legs. It's not walking, going forth by day, like a lot of Egyptian statuary, but through Egypt, Sumeria, and through Asia, and through later in the Renaissance, through Sumeria and Babylon, Mesopotamia, these certain kinds of statues had fused legs. They all had some sort of interesting shape here that was this very unique shape. And then some interesting depictions of the head, almost always something there, and then these headdresses. When you look at these statues in conjunction with the brainstem, and there's other things, there's endocrine glands, there's ventricles in the vascular system, but let's start with the brainstem. I'm going to do a screen share, and I'm going to put up some artwork, and we'll start with your ram sphinx, just to show this. This is this foundational, amazing thing that Brad discovered that has to do with, let's see. Can you see that, Brad?
Yeah. That painting, that Gerard David painting, we use it a lot, and I feel like, and I do cite it in the series, but when we take it out of context, I think the important thing is that painting was brought to. I found out about it. I think the people, the medical people, found out about it because it was published in a 2007 Royal Society of Medicine journal for the Royal Society of Medicine, 2007. It was a paper by a neuroscientist named Alessandro Paluzzi. I think he was a neurosurgeon. But when we put this image of that painting side by side with that MRI scan, that's from his paper. That right there. I put that brain to its right. The picture of the brain, the MRI and the painting, is from Dr. Alessandro Paluzzi's paper. So that's building off of Precedent. That's utilizing that paper and then seeing that correlation that he made and his team made, and then realizing that it looked like ram's horns.
So Brad took it one step further, and he noticed in the same shape the ram sphinx, which is pretty cool, but it's building on Precedent. Then Brad had a much more radical epiphany, which goes like this. Talk us through this, Brad.
Well, it was just that looking at brain anatomy on internet image searches, you just see all these different examples of brain anatomy. And I saw this one in particular, and it was the top of this brainstem model, which I think is just a plastic medical model of some sort. It looked like a snout. It looked like an animal snout with its nostrils and its nose. And the more I started seeing it that way in my mind, thinking like, I think this is like an animal's snout on top of this column, and the proportions, talk about ratio, this sort of composition, this brainstem made me think, I've seen this composition before, and it was in these ram sphinxes. Like I said, the ventricles and the thalamus up at the top of that brainstem just look like a ram's nose. And the
slits in the ram's nostrils perfectly match the slits above the thalamus there, those two slits. And also, here's the fused legs that we were talking about. So first of all, that kind of the rhombus shape in the middle, that kind of diamond shape that corresponds to the shoulders and the arms. You'll see that over and over again. That's the pons. Below that is the medulla oblongata that corresponds to the fused legs. So this whole lineage of statues that have fused legs, once we start looking at this, you start noticing hundreds and hundreds of examples of these things. So at the very top, you have the slits of the nose. Then you have those two ball-like things that are the thalamus. Then anyway, so here's before you continue, I just want to point this out. You see the two ankhs that the figure is holding? Those correspond exactly to those major, those two big, like suspender-looking things, are the abducens nerves at the division between the pons and the medulla oblongata. And you know that ankh means life. They're probably some life-giving.
Yeah, I wonder what those are.
Anyway, look at the nemesis, the sides of the Egyptian hat versus this. Look at the, you remember all the names of these things.
The arms of the it's supposed to be like Ramses the second or something, but I think it's supposed to be whatever pharaoh it is. It's supposed to be him as Osiris. So, like, it doesn't really matter. I don't think who the figure is depicted in the ram sphinx, other than that it's a human form. If it's supposed to be Osiris, that would make more sense, because then you, like, same way that you have Jesus Christ in the brainstem's position in David's painting, you would have Osiris here. But even the way that the arms, they talk about the positions of the arms over the wrapped legs, his elbows stick out. And like you've noticed this, and I've noticed, the elbows stick out the same way that the pons sticks out. So you get these pointy kind of side elbows. And I think, to me, the thing, they talk about the wrapped legs kind of work, selling it for you. To me, it was always the infundibulum. There was always something where, like, the infundibulum on the brain was. It was the uraeus, or like in some of the Inanna statues, she has a castle crown and there's a window. There's always something that would represent sort of what would be considered the third eye or something like that, but it's the infundibulum. And that infundibulum is where the fluids from the hypothalamus, and they come, it's where sort of the nervous system interacts with the endocrine system. And that passage of the infundibulum from the hypothalamus down into the pituitary. And then the pituitary they talk about as being the master gland, but really the pituitary gets its orders from that hypothalamus and it sends it through that infundibulum. So if you look at the ram sphinx, that uraeus is right where it's not as noticeable on this model, because you see that infundibulum is just sort of a smaller dot. You see it more noticeably on other images, but that there always seemed to be something where the infundibulum was, which is right in the middle of above the eyes on these human figures. And I think that was that. And even in this brainstem statue, the block above the pharaoh's head in between the nose and everything, even that block to me is kind of a weird shape. Like, why didn't you just put the pharaoh's head directly underneath the chin of the ram? Why does it looks like they measured wrong and they're like, oh no, there's an empty block there that we didn't have. But that spacing is there also on the brainstem model. So this really opened the door for me and made me start seeing things and just looking at brain anatomy in a different way.
So here's another one. This is one that I saw after Brad showed. Well, let's go. So here's the brain, side view, sagittal view, they call that, frontal view and axial view. So this little bit down here is the brainstem, and if you even without any adornment, it's a little dude. I mean, it's a little dude there. So when Brad was talking, and there's the fused legs of the medulla oblongata, hypothalamus, and the eyes. Look at the weird eyes. So here's the thing: what Brad was talking about, the pons. This whole area here is the pons, and those two big, like, suspender-looking things are the abducens nerves. So now look at this. There's the pons. Now check this out. The most iconic image from Egypt and the most iconic posture. Why do all of Egypt, all the mummies, everyone have their arms crossed? And look at the shape that Osiris makes, how this area corresponds to the pons. So you have your fused legs, medulla oblongata. You have the pons and the crossed arms. Then the hypothalamus and these mammillary bodies correspond to the eyes, of course. And then even the uraeus, where the infundibulum, that big mass is the pituitary, and then the infundibulum corresponds to the uraeus. I mean, that's pretty crazy. That's a number of correspondences. And then the whole thing, and when you add the olfactory nerves in, with the entirety of the brainstem, you get this really distinctive hat. That's a very impractical hat. I imagine you're going to have trouble getting into a car with a hat like that. Like there's no aesthetic reason why you would wear a hat like that. But then when you see it in conjunction with these particular bits of biology in a number of different applications, you see that strange shape, which is the olfactory nerve, and I believe that is the thalamus. I forget what that is in the middle. I'll look that up and superimpose it so I sound smarter than I am.
The thing that I talk about in that Science of Consciousness conference presentation is I go over the idea of what if people want to say like these things don't look like these things, even though to me it's, and like to you they seem very obvious. It's this idea of representational form. I use the example of a snowman, that a snowman is made up of 3 circles, right? And nobody would say that a person looks like a snowman, but we
right.
all snowman, and we go, that is enough of a close enough representation of a snowman. The bottom circle is the legs, the top middle circle is the torso, and the top circle is the head. And you get 2 eyes, you get 2 cool eyes, and you put a hat on them. And so when we're looking at the brainstem, people might not necessarily immediately say, how is that a man or a person or a human figure? It's the same as a snowman, where you just have a bottom half of legs, you have a middle section, which is the pons or the chest or the torso, and then you have a head, and you even have a hat. They almost, so, and you have the eyes as well, and the mammillary bodies. So for anybody out there who maybe can't see these things or think it's a stretch to say that that's a person, then you would have to say it's a stretch to think that a snowman is a person, because it's not representative of a person. It's not, nobody looks like 3 circles, but we all go, yes, we get it. It's a
so one of the things that we hear from people who just don't want this to be true is that we're seeing an example of confirmation bias. We're seeing Jesus in a slice of toast. And so what I've been trying to put together, and I've been talking to a lot of art professors and art, symbolists and sinologists and whatnot, is there a number of correlations? How many correspondences do you need to have before it lifts it out of the possibility that it's confirmation bias? How many? And in this case, we have dozens, let's say dozens and dozens of direct morphological and positional correspondences, details that don't make sense in real life and are only there because when you check them against the biological counterpart, they match up. There's no, like, what a strange aesthetic feature to put these slits in. And isn't it interesting that they're in the exact space to indicate the abducens nerve there?
Well, even though too, but not only is it like how many points besides can you get past confirmation bias by just the visual aids of it, but then there's the stories of the gods and
context, exactly. Yep.
Mythology, where like I know Inanna and Ishtar are oftentimes associated with divine lakes or divine bodies of water, and so then you're dealing with the cerebrospinal fluid.
Oh wow.
And the idea of a mother, even like this idea of a mother who's nurturing and providing sustenance, and the animals, in my opinion, the animals on the legs are representative of being in control of one's animal nature and how that affects the hormones and that stuff. So it's not even just that there's points of visual points where there's like compositional similarities. When you get into the mythology of the characters and their symbolism and what they represent, and even you talk about this idea of divinity, all of this stuff goes back to divinity, because if you look at Michelangelo's painting, God is coming out of the brain. Like, there's this notion that all of this, that if all of these figures of divinity are also being representative of brain anatomy, it goes into this idea that inside everybody's head, inside all of our brains, is this ability, and not to get into any sort of religious thing, because that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about consciousness, or this idea of knowing or gnosis, is that our ancestors were using divine images to represent brain anatomy. And so I think there's something about that again, you can get past these loaded words of divinity or God or any of that stuff, and just get into consciousness and states of knowing as a representation of what divinity would be. And even this idea that people, like you talk about, would worship an animal-headed god. The best thing I ever heard about Egyptian symbology is, how do you represent something that's not real, that's not a real thing, say like thought? how would you represent thought? And so you would put it with a person with a bird's head, because that's not a real thing. There's not
right.
a bird's head. So anytime you see something that's not a real thing in real life, obviously it's symbolic of a principle or some sort of thing. And even the idea of like bearded old men, if you look at like the Greek gods, they're all ripped. They're old men and they're just ripped. They're muscular. And obviously anybody who draws comic books or figure drawing, muscular male bodies is more interesting than an old man's old body.
Right.
But that notion, again, is this personification of this is something that's old as time. Poseidon is an old man who's ripped because the sea is old and the principles of the sea are still as strong as they ever were.
Wow.
So an old man who is virile and ripped is just a personification of something that is still very prevalent, that's been around for forever. So the idea that you would be worshiping divinity rather than saying these are personifications of principles, so the idea
archetypes.
So the idea of a divine God that's representing as your brainstem is the idea of these ideas of contemplation and thought and gnosis and that sort of thing. So when you stop thinking about it as, oh, these are their gods and they think they're people in the sky or this stuff, when you know it's just they're representative of principles. Like we've talked about a zillion times, that the Egyptian god of wisdom is Thoth, and he's responsible for writing 26,000 books. That's just like when you get into like the 1,000-petaled lotus, or
wow,
1,000 is just a number for infinity. So 26,000 books is just all the books. Thought is responsible for the writing of all of the books. Or when the Greeks would talk about, I was met with Bacchus came and told me this. That's because Bacchus talks to me all the time. Bacchus
me
is
too.
Like, you should have a good time, right? So the notion that any of these people, maybe the commoner, maybe the everyday person, just like today, the everyday person completely misunderstands religion and takes it literally. The artist who made this stuff understood that they're making symbols to personify principles and ideas and not actual deities or beings or that stuff. So sorry, it's a long-winded way to just go into this idea.
No, well said. Absolutely right. So this thing is really telltale as well. So the pawns, the fused legs, the headdress at the sides, and then again, the infundibulum.
That has the pituitary is blocking the infundibulum, because the pituitary is a gland that's right there, and the infundibulum is a small tube that goes there. So you're not seeing the infundibulum, you're seeing the end, which would be like male anatomy of, say, a nut sack.
Speaking of as above, so below, it's just hard not to see genitals, small genitals up here in the head. Interesting story. I have a friend of mine that's kind of a tripper, and he was on mushrooms one time, and he said this voice spoke in his head just out of the blue. This completely clear third-person voice spoke in his head and said, "There's a little man that lives on your jaw." And then he went and looked it up, or I looked it up. One of us looked it up, and it actually turned out the Mayans used to say, "There's a god that lives in your jaw." Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And here's the little god that lives. So if you look at this in a skull, this is basically the jaw is right about. We'll look at some more images in a second. But so Brad noticed the trigeminal nerve first. In this case, it's even more telltale because of the weird attitude. I've heard some people say the hands aren't right. But if you take a brainstem out of the body, just like those other pictures of the cut brainstem, one is very slit-like because it's a dead brain, and the other one is an MRI that's alive, and there's actually blood filling up the veins. So if you were to take this brainstem out of a brain, those trigeminal nerves are going to flop, and they continue on. Like you have to. So anyway, the arms are fantastically telling, and so some people have said, "Oh, that can't be because the arms aren't right." But I mean, come on, that's a pretty solid. And if that weren't good enough, if like their arms aren't too low, and you remember that what angle you look at the brain at will completely determine what angle the arms are at. So if you look at this from the front on, then those attitudes of the arms are about right. But then you look at this one. I mean, that's hard to argue with. I mean, why else would she be holding her arms in that way? You got the two wings that symbolize the left and right hemisphere, and even those twin sphinxes. And like you were saying, the representation of thought, the owls, they're kind of cropped in this picture here, but on either side of the lion, there's two owls, which are literally the symbol for wisdom.
Well, but so even standing on the backs of beasts is
like emerging from the the mirrored beasts. Yeah, I mean, this really tells a story.
In the Ephesus statues, when they have on the legs, on those fused legs, they're all covered in animals, and there's animals all over them. And if you look at again, if you look at the mythology of a lot of these characters, a lot of these female characters are masters of beasts, and the idea to have your animal nature under control, and what that means to the physiology and the blood. It's the story of Noah. All of the animals coming onto the ark is representative of someone who's in control, who's a beast master, who's in control of the animals. And so whenever you see, there's some story of Sybil, and she basically turns men into animals, and she's surrounded by like domesticated lions, but she lives in the middle of a dense forest. And I remember even hearing that dense
forest of synapses.
Or so the cerebrum, you have a woman who lives in a tree, but the one on the more cruder carving, like her feet are all squiggly and weird. That always makes me think like that looks like, she doesn't have feet. She's got these weird little. But yeah, I don't know. It just, the more I looked at this stuff, the more I could just remember seeing these poses, and that's all it was, is just compositional shape arrangement. I was like, I'm looking at brain anatomy. I'm like, I've seen this exact composition, and even in my job, like I'm amazed at times where I'll design a poster, and somebody comes up with a similar composition, and that you don't talk to each other, you don't know anything, but like that's part of my eye goes to arrangement of form and shape again. So it wasn't that difficult to look at. Pictures of brain anatomy and go, I've seen these poses. I've seen these. Well,
that's a uniquely, it's the basis of Mahjong, pattern recognition. And where did I see this shape before? It's Mahjong, and that concentration game is all built on that. Yeah. Here is the unrepresented member of our research team, Gary Osborne, the remarkable Gary Osborne, way back before anybody was doing this stuff. Gary saw this correlation in the human limbic system, where each of the articulations in the eye, and the eye, specifically denotes seeing. I can see, you've talked about this, that I see your point, I see what you're talking about. Seeing and its metaphoric relationship to understanding. And so the all-seeing eye is this eye single that we all have in the very center of our head. And each one of these articulations correspond.
I think there's a lot of people that talk about the eye. That's another one of those things in the Michelangelo painting is more internet too. The idea that the eye of Horus is somehow, people think it's showing you the pineal gland. That's the common thing that you always hear people talk like, oh, it's showing you the pineal gland, and it's not specifically showing you the pineal gland. I think if it's showing, to me, in my personal opinion, it's showing you much more the ventricles than anything, but it's also showing you all of the stuff that would be around those ventricles,
Here's a very non-standard, because people have been showing that eye of Horus around quite a bit. This is one of Brad's discoveries. The eye and that diencephalon is pretty cool. I mean, that's pretty compelling, and that's right there. I mean, that's hard to deny. But then Brad noticed this. Here, the ventricles. That shape of the ventricles, and especially this thing that dips down, the fourth ventricle, that is... because this doesn't exist on the eye. Can you talk about that swirling effect that happened?
Yeah, well, there was. It's tough to get exact. If someone looked at that images of the ventricles, they might be like, "How are you getting the same shape in the thing?" Even though the way that the horns of the back of the ventricles go back reminded me of that line that comes off of the eye. But the fourth ventricle, it's a triangular space, and there was some book that I was looking at, I can't remember, and they had scans of cerebral spinal fluid going through the ventricles, and they just drew with the little arrows in a circle that they noticed that in the fourth ventricle, because of that triangular shape, it made turbulence in the fluid, and it
swirls.
The way that it drew that it was swirling, and the way that the infundibulum comes down again, if you look at the eye of Horus, that straight down line right underneath the eyeball would probably be more so that going down towards the pituitary. and so you don't see it as much in this particular illustration of the ventricles. But there's stories about what comes out of the eye of Horus. There's a fluid or a tincture, and I haven't looked at it in forever, but in the pyramid text, there's anointments and eyes, and there's this whole idea of some sort of fluid that comes out of the eye of Horus, and fluid comes out of the ventricles. And so to me, while the eye of Horus, and I think Gary Osborne would probably be the one that would talk about more, that it's showing you like the thalamus, the pituitary, and that stuff. And I would agree with that as well, that it's kind of showing you that whole diencephalon. But I think, in my opinion, it's the eye of Horus is really showing you the ventricles, just because of the way that back line comes off of the back of the eye, and that swirling tail end makes it sound like the turbulence that happens with the cerebral spinal fluid and the fourth ventricle. So.
Now, here's another one that amazes me. This is, as much as I'd like to take credit for this myself, this is the remarkable Gary Osborne, the third member of our research team. Gary figured out something. Gary was way ahead of us. Brad turned me on to Gary. But Gary was, back in the 80s, Gary was one of the first people. Not only did he do that amazing eye, and the eye of Horus corresponding to the diencephalon, but look at this. This is another one of those things that I don't know how you can say this is confirmation bias when you see the sheer number of correspondences. So that whole shape in the middle of the brain. So this walnut thing is the human brain cut in half. Like if you're driving behind a truck that was carrying plate glass windows, and one of the plate glass windows slid off and bisected your head in the middle, this is what you would see. And that middle area there that's indicated here, can you see that, Brad?
Yeah.
Is the diencephalon. That whole complex there is the diencephalon. See that little bottle in the middle from I Dream of Genie? Remember the opening of I Dream of Genie? That is totally the bottle that the genie lives in. One of the things I've always been fascinated with is those old alchemical drawings. These incredibly enigmatic, detailed drawings of the series of stages of alchemy. And in the classic one, I think from Splendor Solis, these giant sequential posters show the alembic, and the alembic is in the shape of the ventricle. When you look at the third ventricle from the axial view, which I think is underneath looking up, it forms this exact shape that you see in the Atef crown. There was this just weird digression that occurred to me that I'd love to chat with you about. The bottle, when we look at Gary's comparison with the Atef crown, we see the third ventricle from the axial view. It is exactly the bottle from I Dream of Genie. I don't know if you remember that show from the 70s, but there's this weird resonance with that turns out to be, well, weirdly relevant. The idea of a genie in the bottle is an Arabian myth, I believe from 1001 Arabian Nights, although it might have been one of those myths that stretches back into prehistory. But the reason it's relevant is this secret kind of hidden tradition that underlies just about all of the major organized religions that has to do with Kundalini, has to do with sublimation of your sexual energy, and somehow through abstinence or through these certain practices, you end up doing something with your blood. The third ventricle being this collection or this important place in the nexus of your circulatory system, your nervous system, and your brain parts. The bottle that is depicted in the third ventricle really is a genie's bottle. And metaphorically, it's fascinating how that bears out in real life, that if you practice these certain things, you end up creating a genie in your bottle that will literally grant you wishes or confer magical power, like the metaphor of the genie. And what's interesting is when you let the genie out of the bottle in an uncontrolled way, chaos ensues. And so part of this tradition this is also the metaphor of I forget his name now, but the guy with his two sons, Laocoon, and his two sons that are wrestling with those snakes. He's wrestling with two snakes, the Ida and Pingala. And the whole thing is a visual metaphor of the snakes will turn on you and kill you if you don't discharge them correctly or if you discharge them at all. And so, like the charioteer who, in the tarot card, if he loses control of his twin sphinxes, the sphinxes will turn on him. Laocoon and his sons lost control of the snakes. I think it's in the legend of Lacoon, he forgot to perform a sacrifice rite, so the snakes turned on him and killed his son. They didn't kill him, but they killed his son. And you think about like a childish term for your boys,
Yeah.
your two boys.
In the churning of the ocean of milk in India, the tug of war with they use that snake as the rope, and they give the demons the head of the snake, because that's where the bite and the poison comes out, and the quote unquote good guy have the tail, right? But I think the important thing too, when you talk about like the genie and the bottle and the shape of that whole thing, to go back to that alembic, is that what Willis talked about too is that he speculated the brain was like an alembic in the way that they would refine wine. So the whole idea of an alembic is this idea of refining and distillation, and that's what Needham talks about that the Taoists were doing, is that it's a physiological process of refining the fluids of the body, and that when I showed the work that I had showed to John, which ended up being the reason that I ended up talking to you and being even a part of this whole thing, we were talking about this physiology aspect of all of this stuff, and he had coined the term sacred physiology to kind of have a catch-all for this, in the way that you have like sacred geometry, And I think that's a really important part of that alembic, is that the alembic is for refining and distilling fluids, and even the idea that you are heating something to the point that there's a vapor. I mean, that's a common term that
gently heating it, like in alchemy, gently heating it. Don't boil your alembic.
Yeah, but even that idea of the vapor, and there were certain terms in the process for me that I would key on, and they're usually oil and vapor were one of them that I could kind of search for and find these things. But I think that's a really key, crucial part of this, is that the alembic is about distilling fluids, and that is the whole process of this regeneration of distilling the fluids and refining the fluids of the body to get to this better fuel, like we've talked about, to get this higher refined fuel. And so showing that the brain is like an alembic is also showing you what the process is, and that's refinement and it's distillation, and you're constantly distilling. What these Naidan Taoist monks would be doing is distilling the fluids of their body and refining them to get to this physiological fuel that was allowing their brains to have more higher states of consciousness, or states of knowing, or that sort of thing. So again, to me, that's the part of this that's very compelling, is that you can actually have there's a physiology going on here. There's something. It's not just, hey, sit and meditate and try and clear your mind. There's an actual physical component to the blood and the body and the cerebral spinal fluid. And there's a whole part of this process that the people have documented in their artwork and Naidan artwork, like the Neijing Tu, and in their poetry and that sort of thing. So and then you had Joseph Needham show up in the 1900s, and he wrote all about it, And so it's a really fascinating aspect of how human beings can explore consciousness, and how we can explore sort of higher states by looking at this previous notion that there's a physiological aspect to this, and that people have been describing this through their artwork and through using metaphor and analogy and simile and parable, and showing you that there's similar things in a laboratory that are happening inside the body. So I think it's something that's, to me, fascinating, because it's actually usable, applicable towards modern day, and we could expand our understanding of consciousness and the brain and the body by looking at this artwork of our ancestors and understanding it from the symbolic aspect that artists understand.
All right, so these wings to one side are the corpus callosum. Look at the feathers, very distinctive shape. The balls that they're around are the thalamus. That I Dream of Genie bottle there is the third ventricle. That's the same shape that Brad noticed in the previous illustration. This is it, looking in the axial view. The axial view is like from underneath up, or from the top down. This is a cross section.
The ventricles are hard to visualize three-dimensionally in your brain, because they're cavities, they're caves, and they're a bizarre shape. So when you look at
and they change at each elevation. They're changing. So
because of their odd shape, when you look at stacks of MRI slices, it's tough to be like, oh wait, there's the ventricles over there, but in this one, it's a weird shape. It's just they're cavities. somebody had said the idea of like, if the heart is hollow, why is the brain hollow? Why are there these cavities? They must serve a purpose. I mean,
Right.
they have the cerebral spinal.
And so when you hear about the alchemical cave or the wedding chamber, frequently that's what so there's pineal gland, there's pituitary gland. There's the very top of the lateral ventricle, that little thing at the top there. And then this thing down here is the splenium of the corpus callosum. I love that word, splenium. So Gary figured out, first of all, there is a ceremonial crown that we've seen before that Osiris was wearing, the Atef crown. And more explicitly, this weirdly telling illustration here of Khnum. Khnum has something to do with the funerary process. I forget what it was. I think Khnum is the one that takes the soul and puts it in a clay jar, like your soul, fire. The fire representing the soul and the clay jar representing the body. That's what Khnum does.
Khnum is a ram.
And he's a ram. Hello. Yeah.
There's a moon and there's Khnum. And he usually has those other horns, but he's depicted with the curved horns. He's also depicted with those, like, what are the shofar? What's that horn? Those, I don't know, that other long.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But there's interesting things about Khnum too, and again, going back to that ram symbolism. So Khnum's, there's stuff that could be said about the ram-headed Khnum, and makes man on his potter's wheel. So it's that idea of making people out of clay.
Right. That's where that, right. Wow. So first of all, we see that all the, when you place these in a row, the pineal gland is indicated both on the Atef crown and on this indication of Khnum, as is the pituitary gland, corresponds all the way through. Like, why would you have that feature? That's even less convenient when you're walking through a door into the supermarket or something. That ball would keep falling off your hat. There's no practical reason for having that ball on the top of the hat, but it corresponds here to the pituitary gland pretty perfectly. There's the third ventricle, the I Dream of Genie jar in the middle, the central portion of the Atef crown. And this is interesting. It's a bundle, like a onion, or I think the iconic depiction is a bundle of reeds, which has its own symbolism that might represent nerve cluster. But look at the way that it's fastened at the top.
If you can get into that, I mean, you can get into that symbology of reeds as nerves and vascular system, the field of reeds and blood that passes through them. So
the field of reeds is interesting because there's depictions of King Tut and several people, like, when you go to heaven, you go to reside in the field of reeds. Mythologically, it's the happy hunting ground. The Indians and some of the other cultures talk about the happy hunting ground. So in Egypt, the field of reeds is supposed to be chock-a-block with fish and fowl that are easy hunting. And that's, I think, where the happy hunting ground came from. And so, the field of reeds is often synonymous with something to do with it's where you go, or it's your refuge after you die. The interesting thing that
I want to say too, like we've talked about the pituitary gland a couple of times. Everybody and their mother goes on and on and on about the pineal gland. The pineal gland this. And the pineal gland.
Mother won't shut up about it. I'm like, shut up, Mom.
Mom, leave me alone. But everybody talks about the pineal gland, and no one ever brings up the pituitary gland. And those are like the Mary and Joseph. They're like the bride and the groom. They are the pair of the opposites. They are the white and the dark, and they're necessary together. And when people talk about like they're needing to open their pineal gland or their third eye, it'd be like it's all in that endocrine system is all interconnected, and that pituitary pineal relationship is much more significant. So you can't just speak solely to the pineal gland as this vehicle of enlightenment or all seeing, when it is that entire system of the endocrine system and the whole body. I always feel like the pituitary gland is like the pineal gland is like the famous one in the family, and the pituitary gland just gets overshadowed. No one ever talks about the reason why those two glands are have a paired relationship.
The idea of the Holy Trinity, I think we might actually be looking at the Holy Trinity, that the pineal gland, the pituitary, and the thalamus. There are other illustrations, and in fact, there's some Renaissance and Dark Age paintings that show Jesus and two, I think it's Jesus and Mary and somebody else, but the altitudes of them, it's one of the graphics that we show in the Magical Egypt season 2, that somebody knew this, because there's a picture of the diencephalon from the side, and you see the position of the thalamus, the position of the pineal, and the position of the pituitary, and the three heads of Jesus and the two people that he's with are exactly in this position. And so Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Larry Moe and Curly, all the traditional triads of divinity. I suspect, I'm sure people more educated than me will tell you, this is the biological basis of that idea of the Holy Trinity: Father, Son, Holy Ghost, etc. So there's the anterior horn, lateral ventricle. There's the corpus callosum, those wings over here. They're specifically drawn in that feather-like shape.
Feathers of Mott. I think
Yep.
like the two
Truth. Mott is truth or reason.
Yeah. Of all the places in your brain.
Yeah. There's the mustache of Mott. No, so the splenum of the corpus callosum. And now here's an interesting thing. So we move out away from the Atef crown. This is another Gary Osborne discovery. This is a ceremonial symbol that's used in ornamentation. It's called the Atef symbol. And we see all over Egyptian art these balls, these weird balls. And they're sometimes, I don't think this is incorrect, but they're sometimes said as the sun rising, the rising sun over Ra, the sun rising over Horus, the sun rising over a lot of the female characters. But in this case, it takes on a really interesting correspondence. And you see it over here with Khnum as well. Khnum is like this all-in-one composite of the entire diencephalon. So in this Atef motif, we see the two snakes looking in two directions. We see that same ventricle in the middle. And so let's go through these. And now if we, so first of all, we see this, the pineal gland is again indicated exactly in the position. We see the pituitary gland. Go ahead, sorry.
I was saying, one of the things that you talk about Gary's work, I think one of the things that I wanted to do with this second round of Magical Egypt was try and get Gary the credit he deserves for all of this stuff, because so many people have put this stuff online over the years. Like you said, he's been doing this stuff for decades, and nobody ever cites it. Nobody ever says, like, it's one of the things about the internet. You can have a blog, or you can have an Instagram page, whatever. You can just throw stuff up, and nobody has footnotes or cites like who came up with this stuff. They just present it as sort of their own. And so I was really glad to get Gary involved on this and get his work to get showcased and to get seen, because it was a huge help for me. And he's done such a a good job of showing this stuff. I haven't looked at this stuff in ages, and it's
amazing. Yeah, and it is like, it's as remarkable as the work is. It's as remarkable that nobody is breaking down his door. This hasn't been on the front page of the news. Gary Osborne, big props to Gary Osborne. Gary's featured prominently through season 2 and 3 of Magical Egypt. I just talked to him literally like a half hour ago. He's living in America now.
Say hi for me, but I forgot.
Okay, I will. Yeah, his wife, just got her doctorate, and she's asking around the different college campuses for art professors that can weigh in on this stuff for us.
One of the things I talked about, I get kind of tired to go in the like consciousness neuroscience route. Was like, let's go the art history, academia art history route, try and get my foot in the door that way.
Yeah, I think the people are a lot more agreeable.
Yeah.
One of these days we'll revisit Mauro and talk. There's some serious neuroscientists, I should say. Not only are the art professors on board with this, but there's some serious neuroscientists and endocrinologists that recognize absolutely. Here's a funny thing. Speaking of confirmation bias, if I were a medical student and I wanted to cheat on my biology exams, I could bring this Egyptian hieroglyph in, and it's a cliff note of every one of the articulations of the diencephalon. I could have it tattooed. I could just bring in a picture and use it. Like, if I'm making this up, or if I'm seeing Jesus in toast, how can I use the picture of Khnum to cheat on my biology exams? Because every one of the articulations and the shapes and the positions and the relative relationships of the diencephalon complex here are all contained. Like, how is that confirmation bias?
What a more fascinating story that these artistic, crazy, weird symbols are talking to you about something real, like the anatomy inside your brain, and how that's associated with higher states of knowing or higher states of consciousness. then these are just a bunch of idiots trying to explain a world they don't understand. So they put rams on people's bodies. They made a bunch of ridiculous symbols that meant something to them but don't mean anything to anybody else.
Yeah.
It makes it so much more fascinating. And you go, oh my God, what a high level of intelligence to take artistic images and turn it and to do what they're doing right here. It makes our ancestors brilliant.
Yeah. And the fact that art and science are unified, art and science are one thing, which is just unheard of nowadays. Like we've probably, both of you and I have done gigs for medical illustrations and stuff. And in that really terrible one-dimensional sterile way, art and science are unified. But this is the highest calling of art. It's married to science to give us this owner's manual of consciousness. And the thing that's significant about this is it's not just how your wang works or something. This is specifically pointing out the shapes that all contribute to give us the experience of consciousness. These are celebrating and schematizing the mechanisms that produce consciousness in the human brain. This killed me. So the two snakes there, this is the hippocampus. These two snakes on both sides are the hippocampus. And then what was amazing to me was so there's the hippocampus, there's the fornix on the inside, and then the amygdala. So if you're ever in business, or if you're playing ping pong, or if you're up against somebody who's a lot better than you in every way, you can do an amygdala hijack on them, and you can make them really mad. And if you can activate someone's amygdala, they'll fly into a rage, and it shuts down their neocortex. They go into fight or flight response. So you see it all the time that really good businessmen or sword fighters or chess players will insult and enrage the person that they're interacting with, so that they activate their amygdala and shut off their neocortex.
That's happening on the internet right now at the art of enraging the population.
Wow, isn't it? Jared Lanier or whatever his name is talks about that the algorithms are specifically designed to piss you off because that prompts more response. And so the cortisol levels, the stress chemicals, no wonder Americans are so fat. Like the constant infuriating nature of social media. And there's the little dots, those little BBs. There are the things that keep you fat and full of cortisol and pissed off.
The hippocampus, those curved parts right there, are referred to as Amun's horn. And Amun is this.
Oh, where is that? Okay, so I don't want to give away the whole Magical Egypt series, but another reason to watch season 2 of Magical Egypt is Brad does this whole thing about the historical precedent in art for people with ram's horns. It's another bit of Monty Python. Tim, who are you who's so wise? Tim? Oh, Tim, you see much that is hidden. So there's all of these images from the Dark Ages of people with horns on their head. Who was the coin? Alexander the Great.
Alexander's on one coin. There's other coins of different people. There's statues of Jupiter and Zeus named Zeus Amon or Jupiter Amon because he has the horns, the Egyptian god Amon. And there's a part of the hippocampus, that curved part, that we call Amun's horn. And so, I mean, we're even using that term because it's the same shape of those ram's horns. And you can see him on Khnum. Khnum's got his Amun's horn on him, by ear.
This is the axial view from underneath. If you look at this from the side, they actually curve exactly like ram's horns. It makes you wonder what morphogenic field governs the formation of those horns, because it is the exact shape of ram's horns in your head, like they're templating the external horns.
Maybe someone would have figured it out, but the cochlea in your ear is a Fibonacci spiral.
Right.
I wonder if the hippocampus has Fibonacci spiral ratios to it or not. I don't know if it does. It doesn't necessarily.
We'll have to put that on the pile for the next research project. That's easy to figure out. That's a good call. So anyway, tell me that that's confirmation bias. Tell me that's Jesus in toast. I love toast as much as the next guy, but that is not.
The other interesting thing there too is what you're talking about is these feathers of ma'at, these feathers of truth. So again, you're dealing with knowing and truth residing in the brain. These ideas of contemplation and thought and truth, and ma'at is considered sort of the purity of truth, the like 100%.
Wow.
So you're also dealing again with the idea of contemplation in the brain and knowing.
Discernment, huh? Truth versus bullshit is discernment. That'd be interesting to know the actual function. Oh, the corpus callosum separates your two hemispheres. They say the thinner your corpus callosum, the more you're likely to be an idiot. Like, have you ever met somebody whose eyes are too close together and they're usually an idiot or a dick of some kind, you know? And the wider your corpus callosum, the more separation you have between your hemispheres, and you're more intelligent because you can separate yourself from your animal instincts. So interesting that the feather of Mott might have to do with discernment. Also interesting, let me just wedge this in here. When in the afterlife, in the Egyptian afterlife, your heart is weighed against the feather of Mott, right? And so people always say, I think mistakenly, that it's like if your heart is heavier than this feather. But what's the point of a balance? I mean, it's right there in the name of the balance. It's balance. And they're never showed with one above the other. They're always shown at the same level. And so when we look at this corpus callosum and this obvious, the feather of Mott symbolism, and in the Egyptian afterlife, the thing that allows you to progress to, they didn't believe in heaven, but the thing that allows you to not be eaten on the spot is that if your heart is in balance, or if your heart weighs the same on the scale as the feather of Mott. And so that's really symbolically loaded and significant. I couldn't really say anything more than that, but Brad will write a doctoral thesis on that one of these days.
Well, no, the thing I was going to say about that is I have a whole other, that story of the weighing of the heart is very poetic, right? But what happens in the afterlife is you have to never play the never have I ever game.
Oh yeah. I have never, they're great. I've never dug water out of an official river to water I've never beaten my slave. How about that? I've never beaten my slave.
It's basically like the 10 Commandments.
The negative confessions.
I've never murdered. I've never done bad things, right? And so if you think about in my brain, which I look at this stuff as being didactic art, talking to you about physiology, when I see that idea of the heart weighing the same as the feather, it's that because you have not given into temptation, because you have not done bad things, your blood is lighter and your blood is airier, and it has this lighter as a purity of a feather. That idea of it's pure as truth because you've never given in to these negative, bad, sinful vice things.
Wow.
To me, it makes it, like I said, that story has a very poetic thing that if you're a good person, your heart's lighter than a feather. But I'm wondering if it also has a physiological aspect, that dealing with the quality of your blood.
Wow.
So I could write it.
Yeah, dirty blood. Wow. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's see. So that's super cool. All right. So this is all stuff that we've covered in Magical Egypt. I'm going to show you something now that is an extremely bizarre thing that just came to my attention recently. We've got all kinds of people that send us stuff in. There was somebody, I've said this before, I really play well to schizophrenics. Like, crazy people love me. Insane people, I'm like catnip for insane people. And all kinds of crazy people contact me with all kinds of crazy stuff that has occurred to them as a result of watching us. But this kid, he calls himself G-Force Junkie. I'll remember his name in a minute. Sent me this thing, and it built off of, it was something that he was inspired and noticed after he saw our last podcast, Brad. And so G-Force Junkie apparently has something to do with video games. And I think this kid's like in his early teens, but I got to hand it to him for making an incredible discovery that I never would have considered. So it starts like this. Here is a indication of, let me just play this back, let it buffer. Here's an indication that's going to play back really painfully slowly of cross sections of the brain. He showed this to me with just a single image, but then Brad suggested that we look at different cross-sectional areas of the brain. So you can see on the right where the slices are, and on the left what that slice looks like in an MRI when you're looking at a cross-sectional slice of the brain. So at the top of the brain, you see it's just the cerebrum, the hemispheres. And then as you get down a little farther, there's the beginning of the corpus callosum. So yeah, we're just starting to slice into the corpus callosum. Then down a little farther, and the corpus callosum and the ventricles have that butterfly shape. That's the butterfly from the MK Ultra program. I saw that on YouTube somewhere. The reason the MK Ultra program uses a butterfly as its logo. There's the architectural feature on the doors of the Egyptian temple. Okay, so now we start to get into the eyeballs here somewhere. Oh, so this is really interesting. Pay attention to this thing. That's going to be significant. So anyway, we work our way down the brain. There's the where the spinal column is, and the medulla oblongata. Those are the fused legs looking at it from underneath. So the animation looks like this. Super cool. What an inspired animator. And now, check this out. Boom! The Baphomet. The much villainized. People say this is Satan. People say this is Masonic. This is all kinds of crazy stuff. It is the emblem of the Church of Satan. It is interesting that a bunch of occultists erected a statue of Baphomet as a statement of the right of, I don't know if you call it anti-religion, the Church of Satan, occultists, the right of occultists to freedom of religious expression. Anyway, here's a cool thing. So as we go down the cross sections of the brain, we start seeing something really interesting. Come on. So as we get to this certain level, we start to notice some things. So first of all, these are the, what are these called, Brad?
The
cerebellum? Cerebrum. Cerebrum. So let's just notice a couple of things here. The knees, the extended, or the folded knees, and the big bulbous mass here, this bi whatever mass of the knees, and the cerebrum. Now it starts getting more interesting. See the wings. See this spout here. I wanted to, in the Ishtar statue, by the way, she has a little church, or a little, like, it looks like a rook in the chess game, coming out of the top of her head that we see here. This spout coming off of Baphomet and then this flame up above is almost identical to what Ishtar had in her statue that had that little spout coming off the top. We see the caduceus coming out of the pants. We see this thing that doesn't really have any symbolic significance, but wait till we see some comparisons here. Then we see the breasts. It's a strange androgynous character, so it's I don't know, it's male seemingly, but also with breasts. So people say it's the androgyne. We have these wings, of course, and then the hands pointing up and down. These, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's the pituitary, and this is where the pineal gland is. But anyway, we're going to go through these cross sections and compare these images, and there is some remarkable things that would seem to indicate that this thing. So first of all, look at that. Look at the flame. Look at the septum, the wings corresponding to the wings, and the knees, of course. The knees exactly correspond to the cerebrum. But this is really interesting. Look at this little section here, this little round section. And this is either the spinal cord or the medulla oblongata, but look at how it perfectly, wow, look at that. I mean, that's just scary. And then this thing, this mass, do you know what that is, Brad? I actually have labels for these. I'll super these in.
No, but even like when you sent this to me, I feel like Vinise maybe sent this to me a while ago. And I get people sending me stuff too, because they've seen stuff and they go, I found something too. And you look at it and you're like, no, there's nothing there.
Like nonsense.
And then I think one of you guys sent me this, and I probably glossed over it because of the Baphomet image. I was just like, oh, all right, now it's, and then I think you sent it to me again, and there was a moment where it was so much in his crossed legs, but there's a cistern right in between the cerebellum. If you look at Baphomet's legs, the way that the folds go down, there's a cistern. Yeah. Right there too, and
I'm working off a kind of small image here. It's a shame. I'll find better a tighter picture of this. But this stuff, exactly, this interesting mass here, this cistern. There's a lot of detail there, and there's some moments of resemblance.
But even the cerebellum, because of the way that it has kind of those stripes, the folds, and the cloth covering his legs.
Oh, right.
Similar. But that weird little circular rainbow.
This thing, like nobody ever talks about the symbolism of that. I don't even know what that is. Everybody's got a.
It's in that white section in those MRI scans. You see that circular shape right over the cerebellum. And like, I remember looking at this, and the more I looked at it, I was like, man, in the same way that a snowman is, not representative of a person, there's enough of the compositional shapes of this thing.
I mean, look at that. Look at that. So first of all, this aperture here, which is either the cerebellum or the place where the spinal column goes, and then this dome, this hood, there's an actual name. I have the label here somewhere. I'll find the label and put it on. But look at that. Look at that matchup. I mean, that's eerie.
The medulla is in the middle there. So.
Oh, that's it. That's the medulla. Yeah. So the indication of these things, which is interesting because it's the ida and pingala, which is probably wrapping up around here. So the depth and the amazing layers of amazingness of this symbol are much more apparent now, but this thing, that's just freaky. And then the dome over the top, like you said, I mean,
but I think if you go through some of the slices, if you pull off the Baphomet off the brain again.
Okay.
If you look where that circle is around the caduceus, where the first crossing of the two serpents, there's a circle in the middle.
Right.
In some of the slices, if you go through, there's kind of a shape that's similar to that, right? Where it is. There's a white gap, two white lines with a dark space in between it. I don't know if it's in the same MRI scan, but I think that the hard part too.
Yeah, look at that.
The hard part about this image is it's one of those things that I refer to as scarecrow symbology. The guy who made this image of Baphomet, Eliphas Levi. Yep.
Levy.
He never meant it as the devil. It wasn't ever. He didn't draw it as a demon, as a devil figure. I think it was A.E. Waite or something. He made like a tarot deck, and he was the one who took Eliphas's. I think I say his name, Eliphas. He took that image and put the devil underneath it for a tarot card. So it then became associated with this idea, and the idea too, even that we're talking about. The absurd notion to believe that Poseidon is a old man who's ripped and muscular. This ripped muscular old man is really just an anthropomorphized symbol for the principle of the aspect of the oceans of the earth and how they move and all their principles and all their life and all that stuff. The symbol of Baphomet is as known as the satanic idea, the notion that people think that there's actually a goat demon person, and that's what this is representative of. To me, is exactly the scarecrow symbology. I mean, if you think about like the Knights Templar, they were supposed to have worshipped Baphomet, but they had a statue that had two faces to it. That the Knights Templar Baphomet was a two-headed statue. That's not a goat. That's not this sort of image. But it's if you look at this symbol, I mean, given the guy who made this thing, he really knew what he was doing, because if you understand that symbol for what it is, that it's not symbolic of some sort of magical goat demon, but it's basically telling you this story that is being told over and over again, that if you give into your lower devices, if you give into your lower animal nature, that's why he has hooves, his lower half is animal. If you give into that, you go down, right? You go down towards the vice and towards the dark moon. But if you give in...
Oh, this is relating to the upward and downward hands?
Yes. Also. Well, in the image that you have, you've inverted it, but like that image of the moon is at the top is white and the one at the bottom is dark. And it's virtue and vice. It's the same story of all the sheep. Sheep go to heaven, the goats go to hell. It's the churning of the ocean.
Wow.
The churning of the ocean of milk, with the Nevis on one side and the Asuras on the other side. The story, you talk about there being, three basic templates for stories of man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature. The story that comes up throughout all of our stories over and over again is good versus evil and vice versus virtue. And every single one of these stories is every villain and every protagonist, every movie is the demons inside of you, and every hero is the good side of you in all these stories. And this symbol has nothing to do with Satan or some sort of idea of an evil goat or a demon. It's basically showing you that idea that this thing that human beings are made of. We can either give into good and be virtuous, or we can give into our temptations and be evil. And maybe that giving into your temptations is you drink too much or something like that, or maybe your temptations is you're a sociopath and you kill people and you murder people. Those are all still those temptations that you're giving into. Like, you know, temptations are, there's a broad spectrum. For myself, I give into eating cookies and chocolate, you know, a lot of times. For some people, it's corporate greed and they're willing to start wars and to
I have the murder thing.
But anyways, like I said, this, unfortunately, this symbol is so freaking loaded with and like I said, there's scarecrow symbology where you take a symbol that has actual knowledge and wisdom and benefit to it and you make it seem evil. Is basically trying to tell people to keep out. We don't want you to know about this symbol, so we're going to make it scary and make you think that it's representative of all the boogeymen and all these scary things. And so some people might say, some people will certainly say that this is a stretch, that they can't see this in this image, and they're going to say it's ridiculous. But look
at the wings. Look at those wings.
It's it's the cerebellum and the cistern in between the cerebellum and his cross legs. It's very similar. It's that rainbow arch shape at the middle, and even the androgynous thing. That androgynous thing is another sort of
breasts. Yeah, the breasts seem to indicate. I mean, the breasts certainly match up to something.
Well, but even that idea of the androgen and stuff like that, and people will feel it.
But I mean, they also seem to indicate like a biological. I wonder what that is. I'll look that up. What those actual lobes. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Modern people these days take this idea of an androgen and immediately wrap it in modern day, like gender politics and identity politics, and talk about like, oh, this is what they're trying to do. They want you to be, and you know, change it. But really, the whole idea of the androgen, again, if not taken literally, is this idea of balance, of the negative and the positive, of the masculine and the feminine, and that idea of a hermaphrodite or an androgen is a symbol showing that a person is in complete balance, that the yin yang is in union. You know, there's the light and the dark, and not that femininity is negative and masculinity is positive. But if you think about masculinity as far as a phallus, that is something that projects outward, and femininity is negative space. It is a receptacle. So we're not talking about negative in the terms of bad. We're talking about negative, and like the negative side of a battery isn't bad or evil. Negative side of
like yin is gravity or condensation, yang is expansiveness or radiating outward. So you can say one's positive and one's negative, but what it really means is projecting or pulling in, whatever that word is. There's another thing here that's interesting, a much more biological, like actual biological schematic, because a lot of these are really quite operational schematics. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. In fact, the way that, see, there's a white snake and a black snake. These are symbolically represent the Ida and Pingala. And it was only when I started studying Adrian Snodgrass and his Eastern symbolism that I really got an appreciation for the Ida. I forget which is which, but the Ida is like your parasympathetic nervous system, and it's that flow of energy that goes up. It's the inhaling of breath, so you know how your lungs fill from the bottom up, and then the Pingala is the exhale of breath, so it's the descending. So it's the parasympathetic, it's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system that these two, the marriage of male and female, are also. You know, like your blood is red on one side and blue on the other side. There's ascending or moving away from the heart, and then a return on the other side. Your nervous system, one amps you up to recover from things, and one brings you down again. So people who take a lot of amphetamines can't calm down afterwards. Their parasympathetic system is blocked. And so another aspect, I mean, and certainly symbols work on a number of layers. So the idea of the higher calling and the lower nature is absolutely valid. But also the upward working, activating system of the sympathetic system and the downward flowing, relaxing system of the parasympathetic nervous system, and then the marriage of the two. And did you notice, here's an interesting thing, it has to do with whirling dervishes. Your pineal gland is in the exact center of your head. We talked about this in that David Bowie video, Black Star, in the song Black Star. He sings that refrain, in the middle of it all, your eye. And the exact center at the, what's it called? The rotational axis of your head is the pineal gland. And look at here, this ball at the top, which actually represents the pineal gland in the Caduceus symbol. I thought that was brilliant. How this absolutely corresponds to where the pineal gland would be.
And to your point about coming and going and up and down, like that's also such, again, this again, you said you could have man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, but if you want to boil that down even further, every story is about up or down.
Wow.
You're either being, brought up to the hero, or you're being knocked down and you have to pull yourselves up. And the hero's journey is he goes through the trials and tribulations and fails, and then he has to rise up to the occasion. And think about all the times we describe up is always associated with good, and down is always associated with negative. You're down in the dumps, you have to pull yourself up. Every up is always positive and down is always negative. And I think in medical terms, there's efferent. I don't remember which means which, but that means fluid coming and versus fluid going. And that's another such a huge component, I think, to all of this idea of fluids that are rising up to the brain, and then the brain is then descending that fluid also. So those ideas of ascension and descension are such, and again, we could probably make like a list of themes and motifs that you could just boil down to, like, instead of like the hero with 1,000 faces, it could be basically this story that's told again and again.
It's the nature of symbolism that it resonates on. They say most symbols work on at least 6 levels. And what we've demonstrated is there's a biological component to all of these archetypes, the struggles, good versus, the winged lion chained to the earthbound lion, Horus and Set, the eternally paired adversaries. It's a brilliant point.
I'm a Pisces. It's 2 fish with their tails tied together. One swims up and one swims down.
Wow.
And like that idea, associate the idea of Pisces being prone to be addicts. If that fish that swims down is a stronger swimmer, he's going to pull that other fish trying to swim up down with him. But the thing about the Baphomet thing too, like I said, so many people get so triggered by that and start thinking about these cliches of, like I said, of goat men, which I never understood, because to me goats are adorable. They're not terrifying even remotely. But if you start to understand that idea of sheeps go to heaven and goats go to hell, it's that Randy Pan, the goat man, the guy who's given to all his temptations and doing all that stuff. The goat go to heaven, the sheep, the pure, or the goats go to hell, the sheep and the pure go to heaven. I think you could make this, you could write a thesis on that idea. Why would somebody draw Baphomet and have it associate to brain anatomy? Is you could make these bigger symbolic ideas that inside each one of our brains dwell these gods and these devils, and you talk about people that lose the battle with their demons, and I think you can make those symbols all of a sudden have so much more meaning, instead of associating with these just juvenile ideas that these are representations of magical, like, creatures and these deities that exist in these fantasy realms, and they're coming for your soul. I mean, it's really what is coming for your soul is all your own demons, it's your own temptations and that sort of thing. If you want to wallow and have a cocaine problem or a heroin addiction or something like that, then that's your decision to do that stuff. There's no evil outside of you that's doing it. Those are your demons. So I think that idea of, once that we showed me that Baphomet thing, and I was like, man, there are some correspondences here. There are some stuff that it does look like it's similar shapes. It makes me think about that idea of Michelangelo's brain. God is in the brain. All of these things are in the mind of man, and it's making this amazing masterwork of artwork to say, I've made this image of a character, but it's representative of basically what the human experience is in this tug of war that happens inside all of us, of good and evil, of vice and virtue, of being a good person or giving into our temptation. And you can do it in a single symbol. Like you said, you could cheat and go with a picture of Khnum. That symbol of Baphomet is so loaded and so many layers with so much information. And I try and do this all the time when I make posters. I try and encode information into single images and tell a story on multiple levels. So when I see people who are really versed in layering symbolism in a singular image, the way that logo design is basically that, you're just trying to put load a bunch of ideas about somebody's mission statement about their company into a single logo. You can, if your brain is wired that way to understand how to make images tell multiple layered stories, you can look at these things and be like, wow, that's such a much more fascinating image now, and it's not some scary thing that you should run away from and think it's representative of this weird world that people think we live in, with like Tolkien demons and hooved beings, winged characters and stuff like that. And once you start understanding it for the intelligent, didactic work of art it is, it becomes fascinating and it's so much more interesting.
Well said. All right. So, have you seen the Ganesha thing, by the way? Ganesha, exactly the same. The view from underneath the brain with the cerebrum and the medulla makes absolute Ganesha.
I have a little Ganesh sits on my desk.
Wow. That's awesome.
He holds a pinball.
That's hilarious. All right, so this has been the remarkable Brad Klaussen. If you want to look at the documentary that resulted from our research project, it's the Magical Egypt series. I'm sure we'll print what the website is for that. Brad, let's keep doing these, and we'll continue bringing this artwork to light. We're going to be continuing to hammer away at this thing, and we're getting it out through artistic channels and through channels where people are more sympathetic to these ideas. I don't think we're ever going to get official acknowledgement from Egyptology about what an important discovery this is, but I think this is on par with Champollion's work with the Rosetta Stone and the deciphering of the hieroglyphs. I think this is a paradigm-busting discovery of genuine importance.
Well, and if nothing else, I mean, for the folks of like the Zahis of the world, talk about calling like people pyramid idiots, this makes the Egyptians even smarter. It just adds to their legacy and says they were brilliant. They knew about consciousness. They knew about the brain. Why would you not want them to know that? Why would you not want? Why would you?
And their science was an inverse. The one thing our science will not address or cannot explain is the one thing that they were uniquely focused on. It's like science has gone through an absolute inversion.
Yes, if you want to add glory to Egypt and the past of the Egyptians, Zahi should embrace the notion that they were brilliant, intelligent people.
It'd be good for tourism. It seems like it'd be good for tourism.
Wow,
anyway, if you're an art professor, if you're a symbolist, if you are anybody who has some authority in the ancient use of imagery and symbolism, please contact us. We're assembling another volley of shows and arguments and trying to get this out to the world to get recognition, not for us, but to set history right so we understand about ourselves. This might be the most important intellectual birthright that we could possibly have, and our inheritance has been stolen from us like a Christmas present that was held up at the post office. That this might be the long lost owner's manual to the human psyche, and because of the denial and suppression of gatekeepers and narduels, I try and get that word narduel in once every podcast, we are being robbed of our identity and our heritage and our history and a completely different view of who we are and where we come from, and of course the importance of consciousness.
Yeah, and to me, that, like I said, the like you were just saying, I mean, it's the idea of it relating to consciousness and states of knowing would be instantly applicable to our lack of knowing.
It's how we participate in divinity. It's the only thing divine about us is consciousness.
No, my theory is that this would immediately benefit human beings in our understanding of consciousness and would propel us significantly further forward in understanding how our brains work, because and now that understanding how to incubate these states of knowing and incubate epiphany and that sort of thing. And why would anybody be opposed to that?
Right. All right. Well, I could continue for another couple hours, but I have to pee and I forgot my podcasting bucket. All right, my friend, I'll talk to you soon. MagicalEgypt.com, folks.
Is er pauze, tweede licht, er sneeuwt de doos, de zin.